I stopped by my son's house to drop off his spare keys and a misdelivered piece of mail. His custom truck was parked in the driveway, tucked deliberately behind the detached garage. He was supposed to be out of town at a conference in Chicago. I walked up to the side window to check if there was an emergency, and I heard his wife on the phone. I could not move after what I heard. My name is James. I am 67 years old, and before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my own son's life, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to love you the most. The piece of mail sitting on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan was a past-due property tax notice. It had arrived at my modest duplex by mistake, bearing Connor's name and a red stamp that practically screamed financial delinquency. I did not call him to scold him. I simply picked up the spare house keys he had asked me to hold a month ago, put the envelope in my jacket pocket, and made the 30-minute drive to his upscale suburban neighborhood. I assumed I would just slip the envelope onto his kitchen counter, lock the door behind me, and pretend I had never seen his financial failure. That was my habit. That was my fatal flaw. For 10 years, ever since my wife passed away from a prolonged and brutal illness, I had shielded Connor from every rough edge the world had to offer. When she died, the silence in our home was deafening, and I poured all my lingering grief into making sure our only son never felt a fraction of that pain. I swallowed my pride. I paid off his early credit card debts. I covered the down payment on his pristine suburban home, and I quietly convinced myself that he was just a young man struggling to find his financial footing. I believed I was being a good father. I was actually raising my own predator. I pulled into the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac. The lawns were perfectly edged, the houses large and sterile, devoid of the character you only get from years of honest living. Connor had told me he was attending a mandatory regional sales summit in Chicago for the weekend, and his wife Valerie was supposedly visiting her sister upstate. The house should have been dark and empty, but as I rolled to a stop by the curb, I saw the sleek, polished bumper of Connor's luxury SUV protruding just slightly from behind the detached garage. It was hidden from the main street, parked at an angle that suggested a deliberate attempt at concealment. My immediate reaction was not suspicion. It was a sharp spike of paternal panic. If his car was here when he was supposed to be 1,000 miles away, something was terribly wrong. Perhaps he had lost his job. Perhaps there was a medical emergency he was too proud to tell me about. I turned off the ignition, stepped out of my old sedan, and walked up the paved driveway. The neighborhood was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that makes the crunch of gravel beneath your boots sound like a gunshot. I bypassed the front door, deciding to look through the side kitchen window first to gauge the situation without startling him. I stepped onto the soft grass lining the side of the house, keeping my footsteps light. The kitchen window was cracked open to let in the cool evening breeze. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of his spare keys and the thick paper of his unpaid tax bill. I prepared myself to see my son slumped over the kitchen island, perhaps crying over his ruined finances. I prepared myself to be the strong, silent foundation he could lean on. I approached the glass and looked inside. The breath left my lungs in a single painful rush. The kitchen was bathed in warm golden light from the expensive pendant fixtures I had helped them install. Connor was not crying. He was leaning against the marble countertop, holding a crystal glass of amber liquor, laughing softly. Valerie stood across from him, holding her own glass of wine, her posture relaxed and triumphant. They were not broke. They were not hiding in shame. They were celebrating. I froze my hand, hovering inches from the window frame. Valerie's voice drifted through the open gap, cutting through the quiet evening air with surgical precision. She was speaking to someone on speakerphone, her tone carrying that unmistakable note of wealthy entitlement. "Yes, the wire transfer for the boat deposit has been initiated," Valerie said, swirling the wine in her glass. "We want the luxury trim. No, the financing will not be an issue. We are liquidating some major commercial assets by the end of the month." I stood paralyzed in the shadows. Commercial assets. Connor did not own any commercial assets. He sold software licenses. I was the one who owned commercial real estate, a portfolio of manufacturing lots I had quietly built over 4 decades and kept entirely secret from them to ensure Connor learned the value of $1. A voice on the other end of the phone crackled with a polite confirmation, and Valerie tapped the screen to end the call. She smiled, raising her glass toward my son. "It is officially ours," she said, her eyes gleaming. Connor took a sip of his liquor, a satisfied smirk spreading across his face. "The clinic signed off this morning," he said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "The doctor said the dementia affidavit clears on Friday. We get full medical and financial conservatorship. We lock the old man in the state facility, liquidate his manufacturing lots, and clear all our private debts." Valerie chuckled, a sound that made the blood in my veins run ice cold. I cannot believe he never told us about those lots. All these years acting like a humble blue-collar retiree, driving that embarrassing old car, and he was sitting on millions. "He is a senile cash cow," Valerie, Connor replied, setting his glass on the marble counter. "And by Friday night, he will be a ward of the state, and we will finally have the life we deserve." The words struck me with the physical force of a hammer swinging into my chest. The clinic, the dementia affidavit, the state facility, my own son. The boy I had taught to throw a baseball, the boy whose debts I had paid, the boy I had shielded from every consequence, had paid a corrupt doctor to declare me mentally incompetent. He was not just planning to steal my life's work. He was planning to erase me. He was going to strip away my autonomy, lock me in a psychiatric ward, and sell the manufacturing lots I had built with my bare hands to fund a luxury boat. He had diagnosed my generosity as weakness and my silence as senility. A profound, suffocating shock paralyzed me. For a fleeting fraction of a second, the heartbroken father inside me wanted to kick the door off its hinges. I wanted to storm into that pristine kitchen, throw the unpaid tax bill in his face, and scream until my voice gave out. I wanted to demand how he could look his own father in the eye and plot his psychological execution. But I did not move. I did not shout. I did not shatter the glass. In that dark, quiet space outside their window, the grieving father died, and the man who had spent 40 years surviving the brutal, unforgiving world of industrial manufacturing returned. The paralyzing shock evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating, and lethal focus. I slowly lowered my hand. I looked down at my palms in the dim light. They were thick and deeply calloused. For decades, I had stood on concrete floors, inhaling the smell of grinding steel and machine oil, working 16-hour shifts to build a business from nothing. I had fought off aggressive competitors, ruthless suppliers, and economic recessions. I knew how to destroy an adversary. I had simply never expected my final adversary to share my last name. They saw me as a resource. They believed my age made me fragile, that my quiet lifestyle made me a victim, waiting to be harvested. They thought they were holding all the cards because I had never shown them the deck. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the spare keys Connor had given me. I did not throw them into the bushes. I reached forward, my movements slow and utterly silent, and placed the metallic ring gently on the exterior ledge of the windowsill, right where the glass met the wood. A ghost leaving a marker. A silent message that they would not understand until it was far too late. I turned my back on the illuminated kitchen and walked down the driveway. I did not look back. Every step I took away from that house severed another emotional tie I held to the boy inside it. By the time I reached my 10-year-old sedan, I was no longer a father dealing with a misguided son. I was an architect preparing to demolish a condemned building. I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. The old engine rumbled to life, a steady, reliable sound in the dark. I put the car in gear and drove out of the cul-de-sac, leaving the sterile neighborhood behind me. I had exactly 4 days before the fraudulent medical injunction took effect on Friday. I had 96 hours to dismantle my son's financial life, strip him of his unearned arrogance, and teach him the true cost of betrayal. The sorrow was completely gone. The orchestration of my counterstrike had begun. The engine of my old sedan hummed a steady rhythm as I pulled away from the manicured lawns of my son's neighborhood. I did not look back in the rearview mirror. The shock that had rooted me to the spot outside his kitchen window was entirely gone, replaced by a cold and metallic clarity. Friday. That was the deadline Valerie had casually tossed into the air over her glass of wine. 4 days. I had exactly 96 hours before a corrupt doctor handed my son the legal authority to erase my autonomy, lock me in a state ward, and liquidate the manufacturing empire I had spent 40 years building with calloused hands. I bypassed my empty duplex and drove straight into the commercial district of the city. I pulled into the parking lot of the central bank branch. The heavy glass doors parted, and the cool, sterile air of the lobby washed over me. I ignored the long line of customers waiting for the tellers and walked directly toward the mahogany doors of the executive offices. I was not there to check a checking balance. I needed surgical precision, and I needed absolute discretion. I needed Patricia. Patricia was the senior wealth manager at the branch, a sharp, unyielding woman in her late 50s. I had met her 30 years ago when she was just a junior loan officer processing the expansion paperwork for my second steel fabrication plant. We shared a mutual respect built on decades of watching each other navigate the brutal currents of business. She knew the man I was before I became the quiet, invisible widower I played for my son. I stepped into her office and closed the heavy oak door behind me. Patricia looked up from her monitors, her professional smile faltering the moment she saw my face. She took off her reading glasses and set them on her desk. "James," she said, her voice dropping to a serious, hushed tone. "Sit down. What is wrong?" I sat in the leather chair opposite her, planting my boots firmly on the floor. "I need a comprehensive, silent audit of every single account, deed, and trust linked to my name or my social security number," I told her. "I need to know every point of vulnerability, every joint access line, and every transaction initiated over the past 12 months. And Patricia, I need it done without triggering a single automated alert to my son." She did not waste time asking questions. She knew me well enough to understand that if I was asking for a silent audit against my only child, a catastrophic line had been crossed. She nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard. For several long minutes, the only sound in the office was the frantic clicking of keys. It sounded like a metronome counting down the seconds I had left to save my own life. I watched the reflection of the data scrolling across her glasses. I expected to find missing thousands. I expected to see that Connor had been slowly siphoning funds from my liquid savings to pay for the luxury truck parked behind his garage, or the boat deposit I had overheard his wife celebrating. I was prepared for theft. I was not prepared for an ambush on my life's work. Patricia stopped typing. The color slowly drained from her face. She looked at the screen, blinked, and scrolled back up as if hoping she had misread the data. The silence in the room suddenly felt suffocating. "James," she began, her voice tight with disbelief. "Did you recently authorize a third-party encumbrance on the Southside Industrial Park?" The air left my lungs. The Southside Industrial Park was the crown jewel of my commercial real estate portfolio. I had bought those 3 manufacturing lots in the 90s when the area was nothing but dirt and broken concrete. I had built those warehouses from the ground up, leased them to reliable fabrication companies, and kept them entirely unencumbered. They were my legacy, the financial bedrock I had intended to leave to a son I thought would respect the sweat it took to build them. "Absolutely not," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Those deeds are clear. They have been paid off for over a decade." Patricia turned her monitor toward me. Her hands were visibly shaking. "They were clear until 3 weeks ago," she said. "James, there is a collateral lien filed against the entire commercial portfolio. Someone leveraged the deeds to secure a massive private equity loan. $350,000. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. The sheer scale of the theft was staggering. This was not a standard bank loan. Standard banks required thorough vetting and person signatures and extensive background checks. Who holds the debt? I asked, my voice devoid of any emotion. Patricia clicked on a digital document. It is a private lending firm out of the city, a shadow lender, the kind that issues high-interest predatory bridge loans to people desperate for immediate cash. The interest rate is astronomical, James. This loan is designed to default so the lender can seize the collateralized asset. How is this possible? I demanded, leaning forward. How does a shadow firm place a lien on my properties without my physical presence or authorization? She pulled up the scanned application files, her eyes scanning the fine print. Connor initiated the transfer, she explained, pointing to a digitized signature block. He used his status as your designated emergency medical contact. He submitted an affidavit claiming you were temporarily indisposed due to severe cognitive decline and that he was acting as your legal proxy to secure funds for your ongoing medical care. James, he forged your signature on the final release forms. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Connor's entire lifestyle was a fragile house of cards built on this toxic, predatory debt. The luxury vehicles, the upscale suburban mansion, the deposit on a brand new boat. He had not earned a single dime of it. He had borrowed it from ruthless private lenders offering my life's work as the sacrificial lamb. But the private lenders were not fools. They would not wait forever for a forged proxy to hold up in court. They would demand their money. When is the first margin call due? I asked. Patricia checked the loan terms. This Friday, she whispered. At 5 p.m. If $350,000 is not wired into their accounts by the close of business on Friday, they execute the lien. They will seize the industrial park entirely. A cold, bitter realization settled deep in my bones. Friday. The exact day Connor and Valerie had insisted on hosting an emergency family dinner to discuss my declining health. The exact day the corrupt clinic was scheduled to finalize the fraudulent medical conservatorship. It was never just about controlling me. It was a desperate, panicked race against the clock. Connor needed the state to declare me legally incompetent by Friday evening so he could officially liquidate my commercial properties and pay off the shadow lenders before they destroyed him. He was pushing me off a cliff simply to break his own fall. Patricia looked at me, her eyes filled with profound sorrow. James, we have to call the authorities. We need to file a police report for wire fraud and forgery right now. We can try to freeze the asset transfer in family court. I stood up from the leather chair. No, I said, buttoning my jacket. Family court will take months. The police will drown this in bureaucratic investigations, while those lenders seize the lots on Friday. Standard procedures will not save me from a predator. I looked at the printed documents Patricia had laid on the desk. They were the blueprints of my son's arrogance. He believed I was a senile, invisible old man who would quietly surrender his dignity. He believed he held all the power because he had a forged signature and a corrupt doctor. But he had fundamentally misunderstood the man who raised him. Print everything you just found, Patricia. Every single page of that forged loan application. I need hard copies right now. What are you going to do, James? She asked, gathering the papers from the printer. I took the thick black folder from her hands. I'm going to see an old friend, I replied. I walked out of the bank and stepped into the blinding afternoon sun. I knew exactly who I needed to call. I needed a man who understood how to operate in the shadows, a man who built his career dismantling arrogant fools. I needed Anthony. And as I gripped the folder containing my son's federal crimes, I knew the real war had just begun. The heavy glass doors of the bank closed behind me, shutting out the sterile air conditioning and the shattered remnants of my peaceful retirement. I did not walk to my car. I walked 3 blocks down the sun-baked pavement until I found a rusted payphone outside a convenience store. I owned a cell phone, but Connor paid the family plan bill every month. He had insisted on it a year ago, claiming it was a small way to take care of his old man. Now I understood it was a leash. I could not risk a digital footprint. I dropped a coin into the slot and dialed a number I knew strictly from memory. It belonged to Anthony. He was not a family lawyer who drafted wills or mediated suburban disputes. Anthony was a corporate litigator. He was a shark who had helped me navigate the brutal union strikes of the late 80s. When my competitors had tried to bleed my manufacturing plants dry, Anthony was the man who handed me the legal scalpel. We had not spoken since my wife passed away. When I buried her, I buried the ruthless industrialist I used to be. Connor was forcing me to dig him back up. Anthony answered on the second ring. His voice was as sharp as broken glass. I did not offer pleasantries. I told him my son had forged my signature to collateralize 3 industrial lots for a private shadow loan, and that a corrupt clinic was preparing to sign a dementia affidavit on Friday. Anthony told me to meet him at a diner off the interstate in 20 minutes. I arrived first. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of my son's suburban mansion. Anthony walked in precisely on time. He looked exactly as he had 20 years ago, calculating, immaculate, and entirely devoid of sentiment. He sat across from me, and I slid the stack of documents Patricia had printed across the scratched laminate table. Anthony did not speak. He read through the loan agreements, his eyes tracking the forged signatures and the predatory interest rates. He reviewed the medical proxy notification that had locked my accounts. When he finished, he stacked the papers neatly and looked at me. I told him my plan. I wanted to file an immediate injunction in family court to block the conservatorship. I wanted a judge to freeze every asset before Connor could siphon another dime. Anthony shook his head. He explained that family court is a swamp designed to drown people in procedure. If we filed an injunction, a judge would undoubtedly halt the conservatorship, but they would also freeze all my assets, while the court appointed an independent medical examiner to verify my cognitive health. That process would take months. He tapped the forged loan agreement with his index finger. He reminded me that the shadow lenders holding the forged deed would not wait months for a family court judge to deliberate. These were private equity vultures. If my accounts were frozen, Connor would inevitably miss his catastrophic margin call on Friday. The moment he defaulted, the lenders would execute the lien. They would seize the industrial park entirely. If we fought this in family court, I might retain my freedom, but I would lose the legacy I had spent 40 years building. I asked him for the alternative. I could not simply let Connor walk away with a medical mandate that effectively turned me into a prisoner of the state. Anthony leaned across the table, his eyes locking onto mine. He told me we needed to fight this war on corporate ground, not in family court. We needed to operate in a domain where Connor had absolutely zero visibility. He asked me if I remembered a specific precaution we took 30 years ago. My memory drifted back to a bitter winter when my manufacturing firm was aggressively expanding. We had created a blind trust to shield my most vital personal assets from hostile corporate takeovers. We named it Apex Industrial Holdings. It was a phantom corporate entity, heavily funded and completely invisible to the public record. It had sat dormant since the day I retired. Connor was barely 10 years old when we formed it. He knew absolutely nothing about its existence. Anthony outlined the strike. We would not freeze my personal accounts. Freezing the accounts would send an automated alert to Connor, giving him time to panic. A panicked animal is unpredictable. He might pivot, flee, or accelerate the medical affidavit to secure his position before Friday. We had to let him believe he was winning. We had to let him walk blindly into his margin call. Meanwhile, Anthony would awaken Apex Industrial Holdings. We would use the trust's massive liquid capital to execute a maneuver Connor could never possibly anticipate. We were going to buy the toxic debt directly from the shadow lenders. The brilliance of the strategy hit me like a physical blow. By purchasing the loan through a blind trust, I would legally become my own son's sole creditor. The shadow lenders would get their cash and disappear. The forged collateral would transfer entirely to Apex. I would hold the absolute, unquestionable power to foreclose on his life. When Friday arrived, Connor would not be facing a helpless father. He would be facing a faceless corporate monolith demanding $350,000 immediately. But Anthony raised a hand, stopping my momentary satisfaction. He warned me of the immediate and severe risk. To execute the purchase legally and transfer the debt, the shadow lenders required 48 hours of due diligence. During those 48 hours, my hands were completely tied. I had to go back to my duplex. I had to answer my son phone calls. I had to act exactly like the senile, clueless old man they believed me to be. If Connor suspected anything was wrong, if he sensed a shift in my demeanor, he could easily push the corrupt doctor to sign the medical papers early. If that happened before the debt transferred to Apex, the trap would fail, and I would be locked in a psychiatric ward while he dismantled my life. My phone suddenly vibrated against the laminate table. The screen lit up with a text message from Connor. His words dripped with a sickening false concern. He was demanding to know where I was claiming Valerie was worried sick about my memory lapses. He insisted I come over for dinner on Friday so they could discuss my health. I looked at the glowing screen, realizing the terrible weight of what Anthony was asking me to do. I had to walk willingly into my son ambush. The 48-hour clock had just started ticking, and my very survival depended on playing the role of the perfect victim. I returned to the silent confines of my duplex and sat in the worn armchair by the window. The digital clock on the mantel ticked away the seconds of my 96-hour countdown. When my phone vibrated against the coffee table, the screen illuminated the dark room with the name of my son. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up. I needed to compose my breathing. I needed to sound like the fragile, fading ghost they desperately required me to be. I answered with a slow, hesitant greeting. The voice of Connor spilled through the speaker, dripping with a rehearsed, sickly sweet concern. He told me he had been tossing and turning in his hotel room in Chicago. He claimed he had experienced a sudden, terrifying premonition about my health. He spoke slowly, deliberately, enunciating his words as if speaking to a frightened child. He told me Valerie had noticed me slipping lately, forgetting small details, and repeating myself during conversations. Listening to his voice, I felt a profound coldness settle over my skin. He was laying the psychological groundwork for the medical affidavit. He was preparing me for the ambush. He told me we needed to sit down as a family and talk about the future. He insisted I come to their house for an emergency family dinner this coming Friday evening. He said they just wanted to make sure I was safe and properly cared for. I closed my eyes and gripped the armrest. The audacity of his lie was staggering. He was inviting me to my own execution and framing it as an act of profound love. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and forced my voice to waver. I injected a slight tremor into my words, letting long pauses stretch between my sentences. I told him I was just feeling a little tired lately. I manufactured a confused sigh and asked him if I had really been forgetting things. Connor seized the manufactured weakness immediately. He adopted a tone of mournful pity, soothing my fabricated fears. He told me not to worry, and that he and Valerie would handle everything. I agreed to the Friday dinner. I thanked him for being such a devoted son. When I ended the call, my hands were slick with cold sweat. By accepting the invitation, I had locked in the exact time and location of our final confrontation. Friday night at their dining room table. The battlefield was set. The silence in the duplex felt heavier after his voice vanished. I stared at the blank screen of my phone, mapping the architecture of his deceit. This was not a sudden pivot into cruelty. It was the culmination of a lifetime of insulated privilege. I remembered a time when Connor was 16 and wrecked his first car racing down a wet suburban road. He had lied then too, claiming a stray animal darted in front of the tires. I knew he was lying, but I paid for the damages and bought him a newer, safer vehicle. I believed I was protecting his future. I was actually teaching him that reality could be rewritten as long as someone else absorbed the cost. Now the cost was my entire existence. He believed his premonition story was a masterstroke of manipulation. He thought he was maneuvering a confused old man into a corner. He did not realize that I was actively sealing the perimeter around him. Every lie he told me was another nail in his own coffin. My encrypted phone chirped, breaking my bitter reverie. It was Anthony calling on a secure line we had established that afternoon. His voice was devoid of any pleasantries, cutting straight to the brutal mechanics of our counter-offensive. He had spent the last few hours digging into the shadow lenders Connor had used to collateralize my manufacturing lots. Anthony delivered a stark and terrifying assessment. The private equity firm holding the forged deed was entirely predatory. They did not operate like a traditional financial institution. They existed specifically to trap desperate borrowers in high-interest loans designed to default. They preyed on vulnerability and struck with ruthless efficiency. Anthony explained that their loan contracts were laced with aggressive trigger clauses. If a single payment was missed, or if a margin call was ignored, they bypassed standard foreclosure protocols and immediately seized the collateralized assets. Connor had borrowed $350,000. Anthony uncovered that the margin call scheduled for this Friday required a balloon payment of the entire principal plus extortionate interest fees. Connor did not have that money. His entire strategy relied entirely on securing my signature on the medical conservatorship documents during our Friday dinner. He intended to walk out of his dining room with the legal authority to liquidate my commercial lots by Monday morning, thereby paying off the shadow lenders just before they executed the total seizure. The tone of Anthony grew dangerously grim. He told me we were operating on a razor-thin margin of error. The lenders would not care about family disputes or forged signatures. If 5 o'clock passed on Friday and the margin call was not met, they would instantly lock down the industrial park. They would freeze the commercial leases and initiate a hostile takeover of the land. Once the properties fell into their legal possession, extracting them would take years of agonizing litigation. I would lose my life work to a pack of corporate vultures. Our only path to survival was the blind trust. Anthony was rapidly mobilizing the capital inside Apex Industrial Holdings. We had to complete the hostile acquisition of the toxic debt of Connor before Friday evening. If Apex successfully bought the loan from the shadow lenders, the threat of immediate external seizure would evaporate. I would hold the absolute power to dictate the terms of his ruin. But Anthony warned me that the transaction was immensely complex. The shadow lenders required extensive verification to transfer the debt portfolio. The paperwork was monumental, and the transfer window was closing rapidly. Anthony told me he would be working relentlessly through the nights to force the acquisition through the legal channels. He demanded that I keep Connor completely docile. Any disruption, any hint of suspicion could prompt Connor to act prematurely and alert the lenders or accelerate the medical injunction. I promised Anthony I would play my part perfectly. I would be the frail, terrified father. I would shuffle into the house of my son on Friday night, ready to surrender my independence. I hung up the phone and stood alone in the dark. The predators were circling my legacy, waiting for the clock to run out. My son was polishing the blade he intended to bury in my back. I walked into my kitchen and poured a glass of cold water. I had less than 90 hours left to transform a slaughter into an ambush. Every breath I took had to be calculated. Every word I spoke had to be a weapon disguised as a weakness. I drank the water and stared at the empty street outside my window. The quiet suburban night felt like a loaded gun. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when I arrived at the high-rise building downtown. I wore my usual faded jacket and work boots, blending in perfectly with the maintenance crew mopping the lobby tiles. Nobody looked twice at the tired old man shuffling toward the elevators. That was the beauty of absolute invisibility. It was the armor I had worn for a decade, and today it was my greatest weapon. I pressed the button for the top floor where Anthony operated his legal empire. The doors opened to a suite of polished glass and dark wood. Anthony was already waiting for me in his corner office overlooking the waking city. His desk was completely clear except for a single stack of thick legal documents and a heavy fountain pen. There was no coffee, no idle morning chatter. We were surgeons scrubbing in for an operation. Anthony gestured to the chair opposite his desk. He looked tired, but his eyes held a sharp, predatory gleam. He had spent the entire night tearing through the corporate veil of the shadow lenders who held the forged deed to my manufacturing lots. These firms operated like parasites feeding on the desperate and the foolish. They cared nothing for the underlying assets, only the immediate return on their predatory investments. Anthony exploited that exact greed to save my legacy. He explained the mechanics of the acquisition as I sat down. The private equity firm holding the $350,000 note against my properties was a group of bottom feeders. When Anthony approached them through the anonymous corporate shield of Apex Industrial Holdings, he did not ask for a negotiation. He did not ask for an extension or attempt to challenge the legality of the forged signatures. To do so would trigger a protracted legal battle that would inevitably expose my involvement and alert my son. Instead, he offered them an immediate buyout of the debt in pure liquid cash, plus a substantial premium for their trouble. To a shadow lender, a guaranteed instant payout always trumps the messy, drawn-out process of a commercial foreclosure. They did not care who was buying the toxic debt, as long as the wire transfer cleared before the morning banking window closed. They were more than happy to wash their hands of the transaction and assign the promissory notes over to our phantom corporation. I looked at the thick stack of papers resting on the mahogany desk. They represented the sum total of my son and his wife and their insatiable vanity. $350,000. It was a massive sum to a young man trying to project a level of wealth he did not actually possess. It was the price of a luxury boat, a suburban mansion, and a fleet of leased vehicles. It was the exact price Connor had placed on my life, my dignity, and my freedom. I felt a profound, hollow sorrow wash over me as I reached for the pen. I thought about the sheer scale of the capital resting untouched within the shielded accounts of Apex Industrial Holdings. The blind trust held the accumulated profits of 40 years of relentless industrial expansion. $350,000 was practically a rounding error to Apex. It was a fraction of my actual net worth. My son had sold his soul, betrayed his own blood, and plotted my permanent confinement in a psychiatric ward for a sum of money I could have easily written him a check for if he had simply possessed the honor to ask. The sheer pathetic smallness of his greed broke my heart one final time, but the sorrow did not stop my hand. I picked up the heavy pen and pulled the first document toward me. Anthony walked me through each signature line. I was not signing as James, the grieving father. I was signing as the sole acting director of Apex Industrial Holdings. With every stroke of ink, I was purchasing the promissory notes, the forged collateral agreements, and the full legal rights to the debt. I authorized the immediate wire transfer from the heavily guarded trust accounts directly into the shadow lender routing numbers. I signed my name over and over, legally absorbing the poison my son had injected into my estate. We sat in absolute silence for 45 minutes, waiting for the confirmation. I watched the second hand sweep across the large clock on the wall of the office. Every tick was a step closer to the Friday dinner. Every tick was a step closer to the moment Connor would try to slide a medical conservatorship paper across his dining room table. He was probably waking up right now, drinking his expensive coffee, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was vaporizing into thin air. The computer monitor on the desk chimed with a soft metallic tone. Anthony clicked his mouse, his eyes scanning the encrypted banking portal. The tension in his shoulders completely vanished. He leaned back in his leather chair and let out a long, slow breath. The wire had cleared. The acquisition was officially complete. Anthony gathered the executed documents and placed them into a sleek black folder. He handed the folder across the desk. His voice was quiet, carrying the immense weight of the legal reality we had just manifested. He looked me directly in the eye and told me the shadow lenders were gone. They had relinquished all claims to the properties and walked away from the table entirely. The forged deeds were secure, and my manufacturing lots were permanently safe from outside foreclosure. Then he stated the absolute terrifying truth of my new position. I was no longer just the victim of a fraudulent medical scheme. Through the impenetrable veil of Apex Industrial Holdings, I was now officially and legally the sole creditor of my own son. I opened the black folder and looked at the assignment of debt. Connor owed Apex Industrial Holdings $350,000. By forging the collateral documents to secure the loan, he had unwittingly signed his name to aggressive predatory terms that allowed the acting creditor to call in the entirety of the debt upon demand. He had put his house, his cars, and his entire financial future up as secondary collateral to secure the cash he thought he had backed with my stolen properties. I closed the folder and rested my calloused hands on top of it. The power dynamic had completely and irrevocably inverted. Connor believed he held my life in his hands because he had bribed a disgraced doctor. He believed I was a senile, clueless victim, wandering blindly into a carefully laid trap. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against an opponent who did not even know the rules. He was entirely wrong. I owned the board. I owned the pieces. I owned his debt. I had the absolute, unquestionable authority to issue a margin call demanding the entire sum by 5:00 on Friday afternoon. If he failed to produce the cash, I had the legal right to seize everything he possessed and leave him with nothing but the clothes on his back. I thanked Anthony and stood up to leave. The air in the office felt incredibly crisp. The terrible burden of helplessness that had crushed me outside the kitchen window of my son was completely gone. I walked out of the high-rise building and stepped back into the morning sun, feeling a dangerous calm settle over my mind. The defensive perimeter was secure. My legacy was completely safe. Now it was time to build the offensive trap. I needed to ensure that when the jaws snapped shut on Friday night, there would be absolutely no escape for the boy who had chosen to become a monster. I knew my daughter-in-law better than she knew herself. Valerie was a creature of absolute impatience. While Connor preferred to operate from a distance, delegating his dirty work to corrupt doctors and shadow lenders, Valerie thrived on the ground floor of deception. If they were going to present a convincing case for my immediate institutionalization, on Friday they could not simply rely on a forged doctor signature. They needed a physical narrative. They needed photographic evidence of an old man who had lost his grip on reality. I knew she would come to my home to manufacture that reality. It was Wednesday morning. The air was thick with the threat of rain as I drove to an electronics store on the edge of town. I walked through the aisles with a singular purpose, ignoring the displays of televisions and smart appliances. I purchased 3 motion-activated high-definition micro cameras. They were small enough to rest on a fingertip and transmitted a live feed directly to a secure application on my phone. When I returned to my duplex, I moved with the precise, methodical rhythm I used to reserve for the manufacturing floor. I placed the first camera on the top shelf of the living room bookcase, nestled perfectly between a stack of old engineering manuals and a framed photograph of my late wife. The lens had a clear, unobstructed view of the front entryway and the main sitting area. I placed the second camera on top of the kitchen cabinets, angled down to capture the entire expanse of the counters and the refrigerator. The third went into my private study, hidden behind a decorative wooden clock Connor had given me for Christmas 5 years ago, an ironic, fitting place for the instrument of his downfall. Once the devices were active and transmitting, I stood in the center of my living room and looked around. My home was modest. The furniture was worn but comfortable, the floors clean, the mail sorted in a neat stack by the door. It was the sanctuary of a quiet, capable man. In a few hours, it would be violated. I walked to the back door, the one leading out to the small patio. I turned the deadbolt, feeling the heavy metal slide back into the doorframe. I left it completely unlocked. It went against every protective instinct I had cultivated over a lifetime. But a trap is entirely useless if you do not leave the door open for the predator. I walked out the front door, got into my sedan, and drove toward the city to finalize the debt acquisition with Anthony. I sat in the cold, expansive boardroom of the legal suite. The massive windows offered a panoramic view of the city skyline, but my eyes were locked entirely on the glowing screen of my mobile phone resting on the conference table. Anthony sat across from me, reviewing a stack of indemnity clauses, but the silence between us was heavy with anticipation. We were waiting for the bait to be swallowed. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, my phone vibrated against the polished wood. A motion alert flashed across the screen. Camera 1 living room. I tapped the notification, and the live video feed expanded. The image was crystal clear. The back door of my duplex creaked open, and Valerie stepped into my home. She wore dark clothing, her hair pulled back tightly, looking around with a frantic, nervous energy. She did not call out my name. She knew I was not there. Connor had undoubtedly tracked my old cell phone signal to confirm I was miles away in the city. Watching her move through my living room felt like watching a stranger desecrate a holy place. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I remembered the day Connor first brought her home to meet us. She had smiled so sweetly, complimenting my late wife on her cooking, pretending to admire the simple charm of our duplex. Now she was creeping through the same halls with the singular intent of destroying me. Valerie did not waste time. She moved straight to the small table by the front door, where I kept my sorted mail. She grabbed a handful of old paid utility bills and violently scattered them across the floor. She kicked a stack of magazines over, ensuring the pages splayed chaotically across the rug. She was constructing a portrait of a mind in rapid decay. She pulled her phone out and began snapping photographs of the mess she had just created. I watched the screen, my breathing slow and measured. Anthony leaned over, watching the feed play out with clinical detachment. The application alerted me to motion on camera 2. Valerie had moved into the kitchen. I switched the feed. She opened the refrigerator and began pulling out perfectly good food. She dumped a carton of milk directly onto the linoleum floor, watching it pool around the base of the cabinets. She grabbed a loaf of bread, tore it into pieces, and threw the scraps onto the counter. She pulled out a drawer of fresh vegetables and dumped them haphazardly near the sink. She was creating the scene of a psychotic break, a manufactured disaster, designed to prove to a judge that I was a severe danger to myself. She took more photographs, moving around the kitchen to capture the most damning angles. The sheer malice of her actions was breathtaking. She was not just staging a messy room. She was methodically building a cage for me. She was guaranteeing that when the authorities arrived, they would have no choice but to forcefully remove me from my own home. Then she moved to the study. I switched to the third camera feed. Valerie began opening the drawers of my old wooden desk. She tossed pens, notepads, and old tax returns onto the floor. But she was searching for something specific. I knew exactly what she wanted. Connor had told her about the manufacturing lots, but they needed physical documentation. They needed my financial ledgers to understand the full scope of what they were about to steal. I had intentionally left 3 thick leather-bound ledgers in the bottom drawer. They were completely outdated, containing financial records from over a decade ago, long before I transferred the real assets into the blind trust of Apex Industrial Holdings. But they looked official. They looked valuable. Valerie found them. I watched her pull the heavy books from the drawer, her eyes widening with greedy triumph. She hurriedly flipped through the pages, seeing columns of massive numbers, property lot dimensions, and old corporate accounts. She smiled, a vicious, victorious expression that the hidden camera captured in absolute high definition. She shoved the ledgers into her large tote bag, believing she had just stolen the map to my entire fortune. She did a final sweep of the room, took a few more pictures of the ransacked study, and hurried out of the frame. A moment later, the front camera caught her slipping out the back door, closing it quietly behind her. The live feed returned to stillness, showing only the manufactured ruins of my quiet life. I locked the screen of my phone. The evidence was irrefutable. We did not just have a theory about their deceit. We had a continuous time-stamped video recording of my daughter-in-law breaking into my home, staging a scene of severe mental incompetence, and committing felony theft of financial documents. The trap had not just been sprung. It had clamped down with bone-crushing force. Anthony leaned back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at the black folder containing the finalized debt acquisition, and then he looked at me. "We have them, James," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet boardroom. I stood up, adjusting my jacket. The sadness I had felt watching her violate my home was entirely gone, burned away by the absolute certainty of what had to happen next. I was ready for Friday. I was ready to bring the entire crumbling edifice of their lives crashing down upon their heads. Save the video files to 3 separate secure drives, I told Anthony. Do not leave a single frame unaccounted for. When I sit at their dining table tomorrow night, I want them to realize they are already dead. The sun had not yet burned through the morning fog when Anthony summoned me back to his office. The air in the room was heavy with the sterile scent of polished leather and ozone from the churning computer servers. While I had spent the night watching my daughter-in-law desecrate my home, Anthony had spent the night hunting the final piece of their conspiracy. We had the predatory lenders handled. We had the photographic evidence of the staged home. Now we needed the architect of the medical lie. Anthony turned his monitor toward me. He had stripped away the digital anonymity of the clinic Connor had bragged about. The man my son had hired to steal my autonomy was a disgraced physician named Aris Thorne. Anthony laid out the clinical history with surgical precision. Thorne had been quietly stripped of his hospital privileges 3 years ago, following a series of investigations into unethical prescription practices. Now he operated a cash-only wellness center on the industrial outskirts of the city. It was a phantom clinic. Thorne did not heal patients. He sold diagnoses. For the right price, he provided the necessary legal and medical paperwork to expedite insurance claims, disability applications, and in my case, involuntary conservatorships. Connor needed a doctor willing to sign a legally binding affidavit declaring me suffering from advanced rapid-onset dementia without ever actually examining me. Thorne was perfectly willing to be that doctor. But my son, in his desperate rush to secure his fraudulent loans, had made a catastrophic logistical error. Anthony slid a single printed spreadsheet across the desk. Thorne demanded a $10,000 fee for the fraudulent signature. Connor leveraged entirely to the breaking point by his predatory loans, and his luxury lifestyle did not have $10,000 in untraceable physical cash. Instead, he had initiated a digital wire transfer from his corporate sales account directly into a shell company registered to Thorne. Anthony tapped the routing numbers on the paper. The digital transfer had bounced through a holding bank across state lines before settling into the account of the doctor. That singular digital footprint elevated the crime. It was no longer just a localized family dispute or a simple malpractice violation. It was a documented federal wire fraud conspiracy. The trap we were constructing shifted into a vastly more dangerous gear. We were no longer just blocking a medical proxy. We were preparing an arsenal that could trigger immediate federal indictments. If Thorne signed that paper on Friday, he was cementing a federal conspiracy. Anthony had spent the early morning hours drafting a comprehensive legal brief containing the wire transfer logs, the clinic history, and the impending fraudulent diagnosis. He placed the documents into a heavy folder. It was a loaded weapon. We had the absolute power to send the doctor to a federal penitentiary and my son right along with him. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The clinical reality of what Connor had done lay bare before me. He had calculated the exact price of my freedom and wired it across state lines. The last lingering shadows of my paternal hesitation dissolved into the quiet hum of the law office. I told Anthony to lock the files away until Friday night. I left the high-rise and walked out into the dense morning fog. I had one final obligation before the dinner. I needed to bury the boy I had raised. I drove my sedan away from the towering glass of the financial district and out toward the quiet, rolling hills of the city cemetery. The air was biting and cold, gnawing through the thin fabric of my jacket as I walked along the paved pathways. I passed rows of grand mausoleums and ornate statues until I reached a modest, quiet plot under the sprawling branches of an ancient oak tree. I stood before the smooth gray granite of the headstone of my late wife. The cemetery was entirely empty. The silence was profound, wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I stared at her name carved into the stone and felt the immense weight of the last 10 years pressing down on my shoulders. I remembered the exact moment she had taken her last breath. I remembered the harsh, sterile light of the hospice room and the fragile, desperate grip of her hand on my wrist. In her final moments, she had looked at me with eyes clouded by pain and medication and asked me to promise her that I would always protect our boy. She knew the world was an unforgiving machine that ground up the weak. She wanted to know Connor would always have a shield. I stood in the freezing fog and traced the letters of her name with my calloused fingers. I had kept that promise with a blind, devastating loyalty. When she died, I had taken all my grief and forged it into a protective wall around our son. I paid his debts. I funded his lifestyle. I insulated him from every failure and every consequence because I thought I was honoring her dying wish. I thought I was preserving the last unbroken piece of our family. Instead, I had cultivated a parasite. By protecting him from the reality of the world, I had taught him that reality could simply be purchased. I had raised a man who believed that when his funds ran dry, he could simply harvest his own father to balance the ledger. I looked at the cold granite and spoke to the empty air. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I told her the absolute truth. I told her that the boy we had loved, the child who used to run through our backyard and help me sweep the sawdust from the manufacturing floor, was completely gone. He had died a long time ago, suffocated by his own greed and entitlement. The man wearing his face was a stranger who had invited me to dinner so he could lock me in a cage and steal the legacy we had built together. I whispered my apology to the cold stone. I apologized for failing to teach him honor. I apologized for letting my grief blind me to the monster he was becoming. And finally, I formally released myself from the promise I had made in that hospice room. I could no longer protect him. To protect him now would require my own destruction, and I refused to be a casualty of his vanity. A harsh wind blew through the cemetery, shaking the dead leaves from the oak tree above. I turned my back on the grave and walked away down the paved path. The emotional severance was absolute. The father who would have burned the world down to save his son was buried in that plot. Only the architect remained. I got into my car and turned the key in the ignition. The engine settled into a low, steady growl. It was Thursday afternoon. Tomorrow night I would sit at the dining room table of my son, and I would bring his entire world crashing down. The sun vanished behind the city skyline, leaving my duplex submerged in deep and heavy shadows. I did not stand up to turn on the lamps. I simply sat in my worn armchair and let the darkness claim the room. The silence was absolute, but the air felt thick and suffocating. It carried the faint, sour odor of the milk Valerie had poured across my kitchen floor. I could smell the rotting vegetables she had scattered near the sink. I could see the dim shapes of the utility bills and old magazines she had violently tossed across my living room rug. My home had been transformed into a museum of their treachery. It was a perfectly staged nightmare designed to convince the world that my mind had completely collapsed. I refused to clean a single inch of it. I needed to sit in the center of their manufactured chaos and absorb every drop of the betrayal. I needed the anger to solidify into something hard and unbreakable. Tomorrow was Friday. The deadline was rapidly approaching. The shadow lenders were waiting for a margin call that would never come. They had already received their money from Apex Industrial Holdings. The predatory debt that Connor had secured with my forged signature was now resting comfortably in the sleek black folder on my coffee table. I was the master of his financial ruin. I held the absolute authority to demand $350,000 from my own son by 5:00 tomorrow afternoon. If he failed to produce the cash, I would legally seize every single asset he possessed. I would strip him of his house, his cars, and the illusion of his wealth. The digital clock on my microwave glowed with a faint green light. It was Thursday night, the calm before the strike. My breathing was slow and measured. I felt no fear. I felt no hesitation. The father who would have wept for his son was gone. He had died yesterday morning in the freezing fog of the cemetery. I was now operating with the cold precision of an architect, finalizing the blueprints of a demolition. My encrypted phone sat on the table next to the black folder. The screen remained completely dark. My other phone, the old device Connor paid for, rested on my lap. I knew he would contact me. He was too anxious and too controlling to let the night pass without securing his perimeter. He needed to make sure the frightened old man was properly conditioned for the ambush tomorrow. He needed to verify that the trap was perfectly set. At exactly 8 o'clock, the old phone vibrated against my leg. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh blue glow across my hands. A new message from Connor had arrived. I stared at his name for a long moment before unlocking the device. I did not want to read his words, but I needed to play my part until the very end. I opened the message and let the sickly sweet poison of his words wash over me. He wrote that he had just arrived back from his business trip and could not stop thinking about my health. He told me that he and Valerie were deeply worried about my recent memory lapses and the confusion I had been experiencing. He said they had prepared a beautiful dinner for tomorrow night and that we were going to sit down as a family and figure out the best way to take care of me. He promised that I did not need to worry about anything anymore. He told me to get a good night of sleep and that they would handle all the difficult decisions. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking. Every sentence was meticulously crafted to establish a false record of profound filial devotion. If a judge ever looked at his phone, they would see a loving son desperately trying to help his declining father. They would not see the shadow loans, or the forged deeds, or the disgraced doctor waiting to sign a fraudulent medical affidavit. They would only see a fabricated narrative of compassion. Connor was polishing the surface of a tombstone while actively digging the grave. I sat in the dark and analyzed his message. The sweet tone made my skin crawl. It was the same tone he used when he was a teenager trying to talk his way out of a reckless mistake. He had always believed that if he spoke softly enough and feigned enough concern, the people around him would simply ignore the wreckage he left behind. He genuinely thought I was falling for his charade. He thought the erratic behavior Valerie had staged in my house was evidence that his plan was working flawlessly. He believed I was a broken, confused vessel ready to sign away my autonomy. I needed to respond. I needed to feed his arrogance and ensure he walked into his dining room tomorrow night with absolute confidence. I slowly typed my reply. I kept the grammar simple and the tone completely subservient. I thanked him for being such a wonderful son. I told him I was very tired and that the house felt a little confusing lately. I wrote that I was looking forward to seeing them both. Then I added the final sentence. I typed that I would bring everything I have. I pressed send and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. The phrasing was deliberate. It was a masterpiece of double meaning. I knew exactly how Connor would interpret those words. He would read them and smile. He would show the message to Valerie and tell her that the old man had finally surrendered. He would believe that bringing everything I have meant bringing my compliance, my defeat, and my willing signature on the medical conservatorship documents. He would see it as the ultimate submission of a defeated patriarch. But Connor was fundamentally blind to the truth. When I typed that I would bring everything I have, I was making a literal promise. I was bringing the black folder. I was bringing the legal acquisition of his toxic debt. I was bringing the undeniable video evidence of his wife breaking into my home and destroying my property. I was bringing the documented federal wire fraud logs proving he had bribed a disgraced doctor. I was bringing the entire crushing weight of 40 years of accumulated industrial capital. I was bringing his absolute and total annihilation. I placed the phone back on the table. The screen faded to black, plunging the room into darkness once again. The silence returned heavier and more profound than before. My trap was perfectly constructed. Every escape route was blocked. Every legal loophole was sealed. The shadow lenders were eliminated and the corrupt doctor was documented. The bait had been swallowed whole and the predator was happily chewing on the hook. I stood up from the armchair and walked carefully through the scattered bills and the rotting food. I did not turn on the lights. I navigated the familiar architecture of my home entirely by memory. I went into my bedroom and opened the closet. I reached past my everyday clothes and pulled out the dark tailored suit I kept in the back. It was the suit I had worn to the funeral of my wife. I laid it carefully across the foot of the bed, smoothing the fabric with my hands. Tomorrow night required formal attire. I was not just attending a family dinner. I was attending the execution of the false reality my son had built. I was going to sit at his table, listen to his lies, and watch him try to steal my life. And then I was going to reach into my coat, pull out the black folder, and show him what true power actually looked like. I undressed and lay down in the dark, listening to the steady rhythm of my own heart. The calm before the strike had arrived, and I was completely ready for the dawn. The night deepened around me as I sat in the center of my ruined living room. The shadows stretched across the walls, hiding the scattered utility bills and the rotting food Valerie had left behind. I did not move to turn on a lamp. I let the darkness settle over the duplex, letting the silence stretch into the corners of the house. It was late Thursday evening. The air felt heavy and completely still. It was the absolute calm before the strike. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over my tired bones. The grief that had choked me for days was entirely gone. It had been replaced by a cold, mechanical certainty. I was no longer a grieving father mourning the loss of a devoted son. I was an architect standing before a perfectly constructed demolition site, waiting to press the final button. My encrypted phone sat on the coffee table, glowing with a pale blue light. I picked up the device and dialed the private number for Anthony. He answered on the first ring, his voice crisp and completely alert, despite the late hour. We did not exchange any casual greetings. We were operating on a strict timeline, and every second mattered. I told Anthony it was time to prime the final phase of the trap. We needed to issue the formal margin call to Connor. We needed to push my son into a corner so tight he would act entirely out of blind desperation. Anthony confirmed that the corporate servers for Apex Industrial Holdings were fully operational. He had spent the afternoon preparing the digital notices. He told me he had sent the final execution protocols to my secure server in 2 separate encrypted archives. He instructed me to verify the documents before he initiated the final transmission. I walked over to my desk and woke up my laptop. I logged into the secure portal and downloaded the attachments. I opened the first file labeled Kich Ban Ong Da Den Mao 1_13.docs to review the formal demand letter. The corporate letterhead of Apex Industrial Holdings looked incredibly imposing. The legal language was dense, unforgiving, and completely devoid of any human empathy. It was a masterpiece of corporate aggression. I then opened the second document named Kichban Ong Daden 2_13.docs to verify the routing pathways for the default penalty. The financial traps were completely airtight. The moment Connor failed to deliver the funds, Apex would automatically initiate the seizure of his personal assets. I told Anthony the documents were perfect. I gave him the authorization to execute the strike. Anthony pressed the key on his end, and the email launched into the digital void. It bypassed all standard physical mail protocols and went directly to the private and heavily guarded email address Connor used for his most sensitive financial transactions. The email was a formal declaration of debt acquisition and an immediate margin call. It informed Connor that his previous lenders had sold his promissory notes to Apex Industrial Holdings. It stated in absolute and uncompromising terms that the new creditor required the immediate repayment of the $350,000 principal plus all accumulated interest and penalty fees. The deadline was set for exactly 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon. If the funds were not wired into the specified holding account by that precise moment, Apex Industrial Holdings would execute a total liquidation of his collateral. The email was a financial death sentence. It was designed to induce absolute panic. It removed all the comfortable buffers Connor thought he had secured. He no longer had weeks or months to navigate the payments. He had less than 24 hours to produce a massive sum of liquid cash that he absolutely did not possess. I ended the call with Anthony and placed the phone back on the coffee table. I sat in the darkness and waited. I stared at the screen of my personal cell phone. I knew the exact moment Connor would receive the notification. He was a man obsessed with his own image and his own wealth. His phone was a permanent extension of his hand. He would see the email from an unknown corporate entity. He would open it and he would read the demand. I expected my phone to ring immediately. I expected Connor to call me in a state of absolute terror. I anticipated the sound of his voice breaking as he tried to manipulate me into signing over the manufacturing lots right then and there. I braced myself for a frantic barrage of text messages demanding I come to his house early or insisting that we finalize my medical care immediately. The minutes ticked by in total silence. The digital clock on the mantel shifted from 10 to 11 and then to midnight. My phone remained completely dark. Connor did not call. He did not send a single desperate message. The silence from his end was profound and incredibly revealing. I sat back in my armchair and analyzed his lack of response. At first, I thought the email might have been filtered into a spam folder, but Anthony had utilized top-tier corporate delivery systems to guarantee receipt. Connor had definitely seen the demand. He had read the exact terms of his own ruin. The realization hit me with sudden clarity. Connor was not ignoring the email out of ignorance. He was ignoring it out of sheer unparalleled arrogance. He had seen the demand from Apex Industrial Holdings, and he had calculated his odds. He saw a massive, faceless corporation demanding $350,000 by 5:00 tomorrow. But he also saw an old, frail father coming to his house for dinner just a few hours after that deadline. He believed he still held the ultimate trump card. He was banking his entire survival on the Friday dinner. His logic was sickeningly transparent. He thought he could endure the margin call during the day because he intended to seize my commercial properties by the evening. He believed that once he forced me to sign the conservatorship documents under the supervision of his disgraced doctor, he would instantly control my entire estate. He assumed he could easily contact Apex Industrial Holdings on Monday morning, present the legal medical mandate, and use my manufacturing lots to settle the massive corporate debt. He thought he was outsmarting a gigantic financial entity by sacrificing his own father. Greed had completely blinded him to the reality of his situation. He was so utterly convinced of his own superior intellect and my complete helpless decline that he could not recognize a trap even as the steel jaws closed around his ankles. He thought Apex Industrial Holdings was just another obstacle he could hurdle using my stolen wealth. He had absolutely no idea that Apex was simply me wearing a different mask. His silence was his final seal of doom. By refusing to call me, he proved that his plan remained unchanged. He was still committed to the ambush. He was still fully prepared to look me in the eye and strip away my freedom while pretending to be a loving son. He had swallowed the bait completely, and he was dragging himself toward the slaughterhouse with a confident smile on his face. I looked around the dark living room one last time. The scattered papers and the ruined food no longer looked like an insult. They looked like the desperate flailing of a trapped animal. Valerie and Connor had staged this mess to prove I was losing my mind. They had no idea they had merely provided the physical evidence of their own malicious intent. I stood up and walked toward the bedroom, leaving the wreckage untouched. I needed to rest. Tomorrow I would put on my dark suit and drive to the suburban mansion of my son. I would sit at his pristine dining room table. I would listen to his manufactured concerns and look at the fake medical documents, and then I would watch the world he built on lies burn entirely to ash. The dawn broke gray and unforgiving over the city. I woke up in my quiet bedroom and stared at the ceiling. Today was Friday, the day my son planned to erase my independence and steal my legacy. I rose from the bed and walked out into the hallway. I stepped carefully over the scattered papers and the dried pools of milk Valerie had left on my kitchen floor. I did not touch a single item of her manufactured chaos. It remained a pristine monument to her malice. I walked to the hall closet and took out the dark suit I had prepared the night before. I dressed slowly and methodically. Every button I fastened felt like tightening a piece of armor. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt behind me. I got into my sedan and drove toward the towering glass buildings of the financial district. The legal suite of Anthony was completely silent when I arrived. The reception area was empty. I walked straight back to the large corner boardroom. Anthony was standing by the massive windows looking down at the morning traffic. He turned around when I entered. He wore a dark charcoal suit that matched the grim purpose of our meeting. We did not exchange any pleasantries. The time for talking about strategy was over. Today was the day of execution. I walked to the polished mahogany conference table. 3 identical black leather folders rested in the center of the wood. They were spaced perfectly apart. They contained the absolute destruction of my son. Anthony sat across from me and folded his hands. He explained the psychological mechanics of the trap. He told me that Connor was currently operating under a delusion of absolute control. My son believed he held all the cards and that I was completely ignorant of his schemes. Anthony warned me that a sudden, overwhelming confrontation could be dangerous. If I presented all the evidence at once, Connor might suffer a panic response. He might try to physically destroy the documents or flee the house and attempt to liquidate his remaining assets before the legal freeze could take effect. Anthony told me we had to dismantle the reality of Connor piece by piece. We needed to strip away his defenses one layer at a time. The sequence of the folders was the most vital part of the operation. There was absolutely no room for error. The legal sequence must be executed flawlessly to prevent Connor from reacting out of blind animal terror. I reached out and placed my hand on the first black folder. I opened the cover and looked at the glossy pages inside. They contained the high-definition photographs captured by my hidden cameras. I saw the frozen images of Valerie creeping through my back door. I saw her throwing my unpaid utility bills across the living room rug. I saw the vicious smile on her face as she tore apart a loaf of bread and scattered it across the kitchen counters. I saw her rummaging through my private study and stuffing my outdated financial ledgers into her bag. Anthony pointed to the photographs. He explained that Connor and Valerie intended to use the condition of my home to prove I was living in dangerous squalor. They needed that narrative to justify the emergency conservatorship to a judge. This first folder completely obliterated their core narrative. It proved that Valerie had manufactured the squalor. It provided undeniable photographic evidence of breaking and entering. It documented felony theft. When I opened this folder tonight, it would completely neutralize Valerie. It would silence her instantly and remove her as a credible witness to my supposed mental decline. It would leave Connor standing entirely alone to defend his actions. I closed the first cover and slid the second black folder toward me. I opened it and stared at the dense stack of banking logs and medical histories. This was the federal weapon. Inside were the wire transfer receipts proving Connor had sent $10,000 to a shell corporation controlled by Aris Thorne. It contained the disgraced history of the clinic and the documented proof that Thorne sold fraudulent diagnoses for cash. Anthony leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He told me that once Valerie was silenced, Connor would inevitably try to pivot. My son would fall back on the medical affidavit. Connor would try to claim that regardless of what Valerie did, my mental state still required intervention. He would try to present the signature of the corrupt doctor as absolute medical authority. This second folder was designed to annihilate that specific defense. It would prove that the diagnosis was purchased. It would show Connor that he was no longer just facing a family dispute over property. He was facing a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy. Anthony explained that this folder would break the spirit of my son. It would force Connor to realize he was staring down the barrel of a federal penitentiary sentence. The arrogance of my son would evaporate the moment he saw those banking logs. I closed the second folder and moved my hand to the third and final binder. The leather felt heavy and cold. I opened the cover and looked at the corporate documents of Apex Industrial Holdings. This was the ultimate execution of his ruin. The pages contained the legal transfer of his toxic debt. They contained the formal margin call Anthony had emailed to the private account of Connor the night before. They proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the predatory lenders were gone. The documents proved that I was officially and legally the sole creditor of my own son. Anthony watched my face as I read the final assignment of debt. He told me this folder was the killing blow. Once Connor realized his medical scheme was destroyed and his federal crimes were exposed, he would remember the margin call. He would think he still owed $350,000 to a faceless private equity firm. He would think he was just going to lose his house and his cars to anonymous corporate vultures. This third folder would deliver the ultimate psychological shock. It would reveal that the faceless corporation was actually his own father. It would show Connor that he had signed his entire life away to the exact man he was trying to put in a cage. He had put his suburban mansion, his luxury vehicles, and his entire financial future up as secondary collateral. He had handed me the absolute legal authority to seize every single asset he possessed. I held the power to leave him with absolutely nothing. I closed the third folder. The 3 black binders sat in a neat row on the polished wood. They represented the complete and total dismantling of the boy I had raised. They were the physical manifestation of my broken heart and my unyielding resolve. I stacked the folders together and tucked them securely under my arm. I stood up from the conference table. Anthony stood up with me. We did not shake hands. We simply nodded. The preparation was complete. I walked out of the boardroom and took the elevator down to the street. I got back into my sedan and began the long drive out to the suburbs. The afternoon sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway. The Friday dinner was waiting. I was bringing everything I had. The sky bruised into a deep violet as I turned my sedan onto the pristine street of my son. The neighborhood was a sprawling collection of identical mansions, each one sitting on a perfectly manicured lawn. I parked in the wide, circular driveway and stared at the imposing facade of his home. The massive double doors and the towering windows projected an image of absolute financial dominance. But I knew the truth. I knew every brick and every pane of glass was heavily mortgaged. The entire estate was a sterile monument to his vanity built on a fragile foundation of predatory debt. The margin call had officially expired at 5:00. Connor was currently drowning in a financial abyss, and he did not even realize he was already underwater. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin of my car. I wore the dark tailored suit I had buried my wife in. It felt heavy across my shoulders. Resting on the passenger seat was a worn leather satchel. Inside that satchel were the 3 black folders Anthony and I had prepared. They contained the photographic evidence of the break in the federal wire fraud logs and the legal assignment of his massive debt. I picked up the satchel and stepped out into the cool evening air. I forced my shoulders to slump slightly. I slowed my pace and shortened my stride. By the time I reached the front porch, I was no longer the sole director of a massive industrial trust. I was a frail, confused old man walking willingly into a trap. I pressed the doorbell and waited. The heavy wooden door swung open almost immediately. Connor stood in the entryway, wearing a crisp linen shirt and a rehearsed expression of deep concern. He reached out and pulled me into a gentle, careful embrace. His hands patted my back as if I were made of glass. He thanked me for coming and told me how worried he had been. His voice dripped with a sickly, sweet pity that made my stomach turn. I remembered how he used to hug me like this when he was a boy, right before asking for money to buy something he had not earned. The mechanics of his manipulation had never changed, only the scale of his greed. Valerie appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine white apron. Her smile was incredibly wide and entirely completely fake. She walked over and kissed my cheek, telling me she had cooked my favorite meal. I looked at her perfectly styled hair and her spotless clothing. I superimposed that image over the security footage from yesterday afternoon. I remembered her kicking my bills across my living room rug and pouring milk onto my kitchen floor. It took every ounce of my willpower to smile back at her and thank her for her kindness. I allowed my voice to waver slightly, telling them both that the drive over had felt very long and confusing. Connor exchanged a rapid, triumphant glance with Valerie. They believed the bait had been swallowed completely. Connor placed a hand on my shoulder and guided me gently toward the formal dining room. He spoke in a slow, soothing cadence, treating me like a patient who had wandered out of a dementia ward. The dining room was a massive cavern of glass and polished marble. A long, rectangular table dominated the space, set with expensive porcelain and heavy silver cutlery. The room felt incredibly cold and entirely devoid of love. It felt exactly like an interrogation room. As I walked deeper into the room, I noticed a fourth person sitting quietly at the far end of the table. He was a middle-aged man wearing a rumpled gray suit. His eyes were dark and calculating, scanning me with clinical detachment. Connor led me to a chair opposite the stranger and helped me sit down. Connor leaned over and introduced the man with a smooth, practiced lie. He told me this was an old family friend who just happened to drop by for a visit. He said his name was Arthur and that he was a financial advisor looking out for the best interests of our family. I looked across the polished marble table and met the eyes of the stranger. I knew exactly who he was. I had memorized his face from the federal files Anthony had pulled the night before. His real name was Aris Thorne. He was the disgraced physician running a cash-only clinic on the industrial outskirts of the city. He was the man Connor had bribed with $10,000 in stolen money to sign a fraudulent medical affidavit. He was sitting at the table to act as the medical witness to my supposed cognitive decline. I offered the corrupt doctor a weak, trembling smile. I told him it was very nice to meet a friend of my son. Thorne offered a brief, tight nod. He did not speak. He simply sat there observing my manufactured frailty, gathering the visual confirmation he needed to justify his forged signature on the conservatorship papers. Valerie brought out the dinner, setting a plate of food in front of me. The atmosphere in the dining room became incredibly thick. The air crackled with their predatory anticipation. Every movement they made was calculated and tense. They watched me try to cut my meat with a slow, deliberate clumsiness. They watched me stare blankly at my water glass. They were waiting for the perfect moment to spring the trap. The clinking of silverware echoed loudly in the quiet room. I chewed my food slowly, making a deliberate show of struggling with my fork. Connor poured wine into the glass of the doctor, but poured only water for me. He claimed alcohol might interact badly with the medications I was supposedly forgetting to take. The sheer audacity of his performance was almost impressive. He had constructed an entire alternate reality where he was the savior and I was the helpless dependent. He had convinced himself that this dinner was an act of mercy. He truly believed he was protecting the family legacy by stealing it from the man who built it. I thought about the massive capital reserves sitting inside Apex Industrial Holdings. I thought about the $350,000 margin call that had expired precisely at 5 o'clock today. Connor was bankrupt. His accounts were empty. He was sitting in a house he no longer truly owned, driving cars he could no longer afford to pay for. He was a dead man walking, but his greed had completely blinded him to the scent of his own decay. He looked at me and saw a weak old man. He did not see the architect of his total annihilation sitting quietly across from him. Valerie chimed in, agreeing with every lie Connor told. She added her own fabricated details about my home. She claimed she had visited me yesterday and found my bills scattered everywhere and my food rotting on the counters. She described the exact scene she had personally staged. She looked at the doctor and shook her head with a perfect imitation of sorrow. She said it broke her heart to see me living in such dangerous squalor. I listened to her describe my ruined kitchen, and I thought about the first black folder resting inside my satchel. I thought about the high-definition video files showing her kicking my belongings and tearing up my bread. The patience required to sit silently while she narrated her own crimes was immense. The tension in my chest was coiled so tight it physically ached. Connor dominated the rest of the conversation. He spoke at length about how difficult the world was becoming for older people. He talked about the dangers of living alone in a house that was too big to manage. He peppered his speech with false anecdotes about my recent behavior. He turned to Thorne and manufactured stories about me forgetting to lock my doors and leaving the stove running. He spun a web of total fiction, painting a tragic portrait of a patriarch who could no longer survive without total supervision. I sat quietly and absorbed every lie. I played the role they desperately required. I looked down at my hands and offered small, confused nods. I let them build their towering edifice of deceit brick by agonizing brick. I knew that the higher they built their false reality, the more devastating the collapse would be. The dinner dragged on, moving agonizingly toward the inevitable conclusion. The meal was finally cleared away, leaving the smooth expanse of the marble table completely bare. Connor cleared his throat and adjusted his posture. The sickly sweet tone of his voice hardened slightly, taking on a clinical, authoritative edge. He looked at Valerie, and then he looked at the disgraced doctor. The silent signal was given. Connor reached under his chair and pulled out a thick manila folder. He placed it squarely in the center of the table right next to my leather satchel. He folded his hands and looked at me with an expression of profound, manufactured sorrow. He told me that we needed to make some very difficult decisions tonight for my own safety. He tapped the manila folder and said he had prepared some simple paperwork that would let him and Valerie handle all my burdens from now on. I stared at the folder containing the instrument of my institutionalization. The trap was fully deployed. The predators had surrounded their prey. I rested my hand on the buckle of my leather satchel, feeling the solid weight of the 3 black binders inside. The calm before the strike was completely over. It was time to execute the demolition. The manila folder slid across the polished marble surface of the dining table with a soft whisper. It came to a rest exactly halfway between my empty water glass and my worn leather satchel. Connor kept his hand resting lightly on the cover for a brief moment. It was a gesture of ownership. He was claiming the space between us. He was claiming the air in the room. He was claiming my entire life. I stared at the thick paper of the folder. I knew exactly what lay inside. The legal documents were drafted with the sole purpose of extinguishing my autonomy. They were designed to legally declare that my mind was broken and that I was completely incapable of managing my own affairs. They were the final key Connor needed to unlock the vaults of my industrial estate and drain them completely dry. Connor leaned back in his heavy mahogany chair and folded his hands carefully in his lap. He let out a long breath. It was a heavy and mournful sigh. It was a sound meticulously practiced to convey the exhaustion of a deeply loving son carrying a terrible burden. He looked at me with eyes that were perfectly widened to simulate compassion. He told me that this was the hardest night of his life. He said that watching me decline over the past few months had broken his heart into 1,000 pieces. His voice was sickeningly smooth. It dripped with a manufactured pity that coated the dining room like a layer of grease. He spoke to me as if I were a frightened toddler. He told me that I had worked so hard for so many years to build the manufacturing business. He said I had sacrificed everything for the family and that I deserved to finally rest. He claimed that the burden of managing properties and finances was simply too much for my aging mind to handle anymore. I sat in my chair and listened to him erase my dignity. I kept my hands resting quietly on my lap. I did not blink. I did not object. I allowed him to construct his elaborate fantasy without a single interruption. I needed him to feel absolutely invincible. Connor continued his monologue, pointing gently toward the manila folder. He said the papers inside were just a formality. He called them a simple safety measure. He explained that by signing the documents, I would be giving him and Valerie the legal permission to protect me. He promised they would take over all the difficult decisions. He swore they would make sure I was safe and comfortable and completely free from any stress. He painted a picture of a peaceful retirement while actively plotting to strip me of my wealth and shove me into a forgotten corner. Valerie leaned forward and rested her elbows on the marble table. She looked at me with a smile that was so tight, it looked painful. She nodded along with every word her husband said. She added her own layer of synthetic empathy. She told me they had found a beautiful private facility that specialized in memory care. She described it as a luxury resort. She said I would have my own room and round-the-clock assistance, and that they would come visit me every single weekend. She was lying with every breath she took. I knew they would never visit. I knew they would lock me away in the cheapest facility they could find the moment the ink on the conservatorship papers was dry. They needed me out of sight and out of mind, so they could liquidate my manufacturing lots to save their drowning suburban lifestyle. Connor turned his head and looked down the table at the man in the rumpled gray suit. He asked the stranger for his professional opinion. Eris Thorne adjusted his collar and offered a slow, clinical nod. The disgraced doctor played his part flawlessly. He adopted a tone of grave medical authority. He stated that based on his observations tonight and the behavioral history provided by the family, it was his professional conclusion that I was suffering from rapid cognitive deterioration. He said that leaving me to manage my own affairs would be an act of profound medical negligence. He confirmed that placing me under an emergency conservatorship was the only responsible course of action. The sheer mechanics of their conspiracy were terrifying in their efficiency. They had covered every angle. They had the loving narrative. They had the staged evidence of my confusion at the duplex. They had the corrupt medical professional ready to provide the official legal backing. It was a flawless execution of a hostile takeover disguised as an intervention. Valerie reached out and placed her manicured hand on top of the manila folder. She flipped the cover open, revealing the stark black text of the legal petition. My name was printed at the top. The blank signature line waited at the bottom. She reached into the pocket of her pristine white apron and pulled out a heavy silver pen. She clicked the top with her thumb. The sharp metallic sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet dining room. She extended her arm across the marble and held the pen out to me. Her eyes were gleaming with a bright, feverish triumph. She could barely contain her excitement. She was looking at the pen as if it were a magic wand that would instantly erase their crushing debts and fund their luxury facade for the rest of their lives. Connor leaned forward again. His voice dropped to a soft, encouraging whisper. He told me to just sign my name on the bottom line. He promised that once I signed, everything would be okay. He said we could put all this sadness behind us and just be a happy family again. The air in the room grew incredibly dense. The predatory anticipation radiated from the three of them like heat from a furnace. They were waiting for the confused old man to surrender. They were waiting for the final victory. I looked at the silver pen trembling slightly in the hand of Valerie. I looked at the fake sorrow painted across the face of my son. I felt the solid, comforting weight of the leather satchel resting against my leg. I felt the 3 black binders waiting patiently inside. I did not raise my hand. I did not reach for the pen. I sat perfectly still and let the silence stretch out across the dining room. I let the seconds tick by until the heavy anticipation began to curdle into something else. I watched the confident smile on the face of Valerie begin to falter. I saw a tiny flicker of confusion cross the eyes of Connor. They expected me to weep. They expected me to argue. They expected me to sign. They did not expect absolute unbroken stillness. I slowly turned my head away from my son and his wife. I ignored the pen completely. I looked straight down the length of the marble table and locked my eyes directly onto the face of the disgraced physician. I dropped the facade of the frail and confused patriarch. I let the cold, mechanical authority of 40 years in the industrial sector fill my voice. The words cut through the heavy silence of the dining room with the precision of a surgical blade. Are you prepared to commit federal wire fraud for $10,000, doctor? The temperature in the room plummeted instantly. The clinical mask of Eris Thorne shattered into 1,000 pieces. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at me in absolute horror. The silver pen dropped from the fingers of Valerie and clattered loudly against the polished marble table. The illusion of my surrender was entirely dead. The execution had officially begun. The words hung in the air of the dining room. The silence was absolute and suffocating. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the face of the disgraced doctor. I watched the color drain completely from his cheeks. His skin turned a pale, sickly gray under the bright lights of the crystal chandelier. He stopped breathing. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. He understood instantly that his anonymity was gone. He realized the frightened old man he came to exploit was actually holding a federal noose around his neck. He pushed his chair back from the table. The heavy wood scraped loudly against the marble floor. He looked at Connor with an expression of pure, unfiltered panic. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had believed this was an easy payday. He thought he was dealing with an oblivious family and a helpless victim. He never anticipated being confronted with federal statutes. He backed away from the table as if the marble had caught fire. He knew his career was already hanging by a thread. He knew a federal wire fraud charge would put him behind bars for decades. He looked at Connor with pure hatred, realizing he had been lured into a deadly trap. Connor realized the trap was malfunctioning. He did not understand the precise nature of the threat, but he recognized the fear in the eyes of his hired doctor. He jumped up from his chair. He slammed his palms down hard on the table, causing the expensive porcelain plates to rattle. He raised his voice and pointed a shaking finger at me. He told Eris Thorne not to listen to a single word I said. He shouted that this was exactly the severe paranoia he had been talking about. He claimed my accusation was proof of my rapid cognitive decline. He manufactured a frantic narrative right there on the spot. He told the doctor I was hallucinating and suffering from intense delusions. He said I was making up wild stories about bribes and wire fraud because my mind was completely broken. He claimed my brain was inventing elaborate conspiracies to cope with my inability to manage basic tasks. He played the role of the desperate, loving son trying to manage a violently senile father. His voice echoed off the high ceilings of the mansion. He paced back and forth behind his chair, projecting his voice to dominate the room. He told Valerie to stay calm and promised her everything was fine. He looked at the doctor and pleaded with him to ignore my insane ramblings. He shouted that I did not even know what day it was, let alone understand complex legal terms. He painted a tragic portrait of a patriarch whose brain was turning to mush. He threw all of his energy into maintaining the facade. He believed that if he shouted loud enough, he could force reality to bend to his will. He thought volume could compensate for the sudden loss of control. He thought his aggression could force the doctor to sign the papers and validate his theft. I did not interrupt his frantic monologue. I sat perfectly still with my hands resting quietly on the table. I watched my son exhaust himself. I observed the sweat forming on his forehead and the desperate panic tightening the muscles in his neck. I felt absolutely nothing for him. The emotional bond of fatherhood had been severed and cauterized. I was watching a cornered predator thrash against the bars of a cage it had built for itself. I waited for his shouting to reach a fever pitch and then slowly begin to crack. I waited until he ran out of breath and stopped pacing. The heavy silence returned to the dining room. Connor stood behind his chair with his chest heaving, waiting for the doctor to agree with his diagnosis of my insanity. I reached down to the worn leather satchel resting against my leg. I unfastened the metal buckle. The sharp click echoed clearly in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out the first of the 3 black folders. The leather binder was thick and heavy. I lifted it and placed it on the table. I placed my hand flat against the cover and pushed. The folder slid smoothly across the polished marble. It glided past the silver cutlery and the crystal water glasses. It came to a perfect stop right in front of Valerie. She stared at the black leather as if it were a venomous snake. She looked up at me with wide, frightened eyes. I did not say a word. I simply looked at her and waited. She reached out with trembling fingers. She grabbed the edge of the cover and slowly flipped it open. The bright light from the chandelier illuminated the glossy, high-definition photographs. Valerie looked down at the first page. All the blood vanished from her face in an instant. She stopped breathing entirely. The photograph showed her standing in my kitchen, pouring a gallon of milk across my pristine floor. She turned the page with a shaking hand. The next image showed her violently kicking my utility bills across my living room rug. Another page revealed her tearing a loaf of bread to pieces and scattering it near the sink. She saw the timestamps printed clearly at the bottom of each photograph. She saw the exact minute she had violated my sanctuary. She saw herself rummaging through my private study and tearing through my desk drawers. She saw the absolute proof of her own sociopathic greed. The hidden cameras had captured her malice in absolute crystal-clear detail. She saw her own vicious smile frozen in time. She saw herself committing felony trespassing and destruction of property. She realized that every single thing she had done in the dark had been recorded in perfect clarity. She realized the squalor she had staged to prove my dementia was now the exact evidence that would send her to a prison cell. A low, whimpering sound escaped her throat. She tried to speak, but her vocal cords refused to work. She dropped the heavy silver pen she had been holding. It rolled off the table and fell to the floor. She looked up at me and saw the cold, unforgiving stare of a man who had survived a lifetime of corporate warfare. She finally understood that I was not a fragile target. I was the architect of her destruction. Connor walked over and looked down at the folder over her shoulder. His confident posture collapsed immediately. The shouting died completely in his throat. He stared at the undeniable photographic evidence of their conspiracy. He saw the meticulous timeline of their treachery laid bare. He saw the end of his suburban fantasy. He realized that the erratic behavior he had laughed at was entirely manufactured by his own wife. He realized I had allowed them to stage their little theater just to gather enough rope to hang them both. The entire foundation of his medical intervention narrative crumbled into dust before his eyes. He could no longer claim I was a confused elder living in dangerous squalor. He could no longer claim he was acting out of love and concern. The truth was naked and undeniable upon the table. He was a predator who had accidentally crawled into the mouth of a much larger beast. The illusion of the sick old man evaporated instantly. They realized I had never lost my mind. They realized I had been watching their every move. They realized they were standing in the center of a perfectly orchestrated execution. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The fake family dinner was over and the reckoning had arrived. The silence in the dining room hung like a heavy, suffocating shroud over the long marble table. Connor and Valerie remained completely paralyzed by the revelation of the first black binder. Their elaborate fiction of my mental decline had been crushed under the weight of undeniable photographic proof. I turned my attention away from the trembling form of my daughter-in-law and focused entirely on the man sitting at the far end of the room. Aris Thorne was breathing in shallow, erratic gasps. The disgraced physician had entered this house expecting to perform a simple and highly lucrative task. He had intended to sign a fraudulent medical document, condemn an old man to a locked ward, and collect his illicit $10,000 fee. He never anticipated stepping into a meticulously designed federal trap. I kept my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face as I reached into my worn leather satchel for the second time. I pulled out the second black binder. The thick leather felt substantial and cold in my steady grasp. I placed it on the polished marble surface and pushed it firmly toward the opposite end of the table. The heavy binder glided smoothly past the crystal wineglasses and the untouched plates of food. It came to a perfect stop directly in front of the doctor. I told Thorne to open it. I kept my voice completely devoid of any emotion or hesitation. I instructed him to look very closely at the documents my legal counsel had prepared exclusively for him. Thorne hesitated for a long, agonizing moment. His hands hovered over the black cover like a man ordered to reach his bare hands into a burning fire. His arrogant clinical detachment was completely gone. He was no longer a medical professional sitting in judgment of my mental faculties. He was a terrified criminal realizing he had been cornered in a room with no exits. Thorne slowly lifted the black leather cover. The bright light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the stark white pages of the legal brief Anthony had drafted. The first page was a direct formal petition addressed to the State Medical Board demanding the immediate and permanent revocation of his medical license. I watched the eyes of the doctor dart frantically across the dense legal paragraphs. He saw his own name printed in bold black ink next to severe accusations of malpractice and criminal conspiracy. But the medical board petition was merely the opening salvo of his destruction. Thorne turned to the second page, and his entire body shuddered violently. I had included the banking logs Anthony had intercepted from the corporate servers. The glossy pages displayed the undeniable digital footprint of a federal crime. They showed the exact routing numbers of the anonymous shell corporation Thorne used to hide his illicit bribes. They detailed the precise minute Connor had wired $10,000 from his corporate sales account to purchase my fraudulent diagnosis. The color drained from the face of the doctor until his skin resembled old, brittle parchment. The reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the force of a falling building. He realized instantly that his anonymity was permanently destroyed, and his criminal enterprise was entirely exposed. I told him that my attorney had already prepared the federal indictments. I explained that the documents shaking in his hands were exact copies of the digital files currently sitting on a secure server waiting to be transmitted to the federal prosecutor. I informed him that the digital wire transfer elevated his simple local bribery scheme into a thoroughly documented federal conspiracy. I told him that the penalty for federal wire fraud combined with the deliberate exploitation of a vulnerable elder carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would ensure he died in a federal penitentiary. Thorne dropped the pages onto the marble as if they were coated in burning acid. He pushed his heavy mahogany chair back from the table with a loud scraping sound that echoed harshly off the high ceilings. He stood up on shaking, unsteady legs. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull enough air into his panic-stricken lungs. He looked down at the federal evidence, and then he turned his head to look directly at my son. The absolute fear in the eyes of the doctor instantly transmuted into a violent, hateful rage. Thorne pointed a trembling finger at Connor. He cursed my son with a viciousness that shattered the manufactured elegance of the sterile suburban dining room. He told Connor that he had lied about everything. He told Connor that he had promised an easy job with a compliant and genuinely senile victim. He stated that Connor had sworn there would be no legal blowback and absolutely no hidden complications. Thorne realized he had been lured into a catastrophic scenario by a desperate and arrogant amateur. He told Connor that he was a blind fool who had just destroyed them both. Connor stood frozen behind his chair, completely unable to mount a coherent defense. The elaborate web of lies my son had spun was disintegrating faster than his mind could possibly comprehend. He tried to speak. He tried to raise his hands and offer some pathetic, hollow assurance to the terrified doctor. Connor begged Thorne to sit back down and promised they could figure a way out of the mess together. He pleaded with the man to stay and sign the conservatorship papers, claiming that all their problems would magically disappear once they had full legal control of my estate. Thorne did not listen to a single desperate word. He recognized the frantic flailing of a drowning man, and he had absolutely no intention of being pulled down into the dark water. He told Connor that the deal was entirely dead and buried. He stated that he would deny ever setting foot inside this heavily mortgaged house. He promised that he would gladly testify against Connor if the federal prosecutors ever offered him a plea deal. Thorne turned his back on the dining table and practically sprinted toward the arched entryway of the room. His heavy footsteps slammed against the hardwood floors of the hallway as he rushed blindly toward the front door. The frantic clicking of the brass deadbolt echoed loudly through the silent house, followed by the tremendous slam of the heavy wooden door. A few seconds later, the screeching tires of his car tore through the quiet suburban street as the disgraced doctor fled the trap. The sudden violent departure of the doctor left a ringing, deafening vacuum in the dining room. The silence rushed back in to fill the massive space left by his panic. I sat calmly in my chair and observed the two people left standing across the table from me. Valerie was still staring at the high-definition photographs of her crimes, weeping silently into her hands. Connor stood completely paralyzed behind his tall chair. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The grand medical intervention he had meticulously planned for months had been entirely dismantled in a matter of minutes. He was officially stripped of his medical proxy. He was stripped of his star witness. He had lost the fraudulent authority he desperately needed to seize my manufacturing lots and save his collapsing life. Connor looked at the empty chair where Thorne had been sitting, and then he slowly turned his gaze back to me. He looked at the calm, composed father he had tried to bury alive. He looked at the black folders resting on his expensive marble table. The predatory anticipation that had fueled him all evening was completely dead. It was replaced by a creeping, suffocating dread. He realized he was standing on an isolated island of his own creation. He had no allies left to call. He had no legal leverage left to exploit. He was completely alone with the man he had tried to destroy. I did not speak to him. I simply rested my hand on my leather satchel and prepared to deliver the final lethal blow. The heavy oak door slammed shut, echoing through the massive empty house. The sound vibrated against the marble floors and faded into a thick and suffocating silence. Valerie remained completely motionless in her chair. She stared blindly at the glossy photographs of her own crimes. She was weeping softly, but the sound was hollow and pathetic. She had been entirely broken by the first folder. I turned my eyes away from her ruined face and looked at the man standing at the head of the table. Connor stood completely paralyzed. The veins in his neck were pulsing rapidly under his skin. The grand illusion of his power was disintegrating around him. He had lost his medical proxy. He had lost his primary witness. He was standing in the wreckage of his own arrogant conspiracy. For a long moment, he simply stared at the empty space where the disgraced doctor had been sitting. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow gasps. He was a predator who had suddenly realized he was bleeding out inside a cage. I did not speak. I let the absolute silence crush him. I watched the frantic calculations running behind his eyes. I watched him cycle through denial and terror. And then I watched the terror harden into a violent, unhinged rage. Connor slammed his fists down onto the marble table. The impact sent a crystal water glass toppling over. The water spilled across the polished stone and dripped onto the expensive rug. He did not care. He leaned forward and glared at me with pure hatred. His face was flushed red and his teeth were bared. The polished facade of the loving son was gone forever. He looked like a wild and desperate animal. He began to shout. The sound was harsh and jagged, tearing through the quiet dining room. He told me I was a foolish old man. He screamed that I thought I was so clever for scaring away his doctor. He yelled that my little folders and my hidden cameras meant absolutely nothing. He said I had won a meaningless battle while losing the entire war. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and told me that my industrial estate was already gone. He paced back and forth behind his chair, completely losing control. He confessed everything in a torrent of furious screaming. He told me he had forged my signature months ago. He admitted he had used my manufacturing lots and my commercial properties as collateral for massive shadow loans. He yelled that his lenders were ruthless and completely unregulated. He told me they did not care about family disputes or fake medical papers. He said they only cared about the deadline, and the deadline had expired at 5 o'clock this afternoon. Connor laughed. It was a terrible, desperate sound. He told me that a massive private equity firm called Apex Industrial Holdings had acquired all of his debt. He screamed that they had issued a margin call for $350,000. He told me that since I had refused to sign the conservatorship papers, he had no way to access the funds to pay them. He yelled that we were both going to lose everything. He said the corporate vultures were going to seize his mansion and my factories by Monday morning. He stood there panting and sweating, believing he had triggered a mutual destruction. He thought he was taking me down into the abyss with him. I sat perfectly still and absorbed his furious confession. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to his violent posturing. I simply waited for his echoing shouts to fade into the high ceilings. I watched him cling to the illusion that he had still somehow managed to defeat me. A quiet footstep sounded from the dark hallway behind me. The noise was incredibly soft, but it made Connor freeze instantly. He stared over my shoulder as a tall figure stepped out of the shadows and entered the bright light of the dining room. Anthony walked slowly toward the marble table. He wore his dark charcoal suit, and his expression was completely blank. He moved with the quiet efficiency of a corporate executioner. He did not look at Valerie or acknowledge her weeping. He did not react to the spilled water or the furious red face of my son. He simply walked to my side and stood with his hands folded in front of him. He carried the third black leather folder. Connor stared at the stranger in his house. His jaw opened slightly. The false bravado evaporated from his posture. He asked me who this man was and what he was doing here. His voice was no longer a furious roar. It was a weak and trembling whisper. He felt the atmosphere in the room shift. He sensed that the trap had another layer he had not anticipated. Anthony placed the third black folder on the table. He slid it precisely across the marble until it rested directly in front of Connor. I looked up at my son. I kept my eyes completely locked onto his. I let the cold weight of 40 years of industrial authority fill my voice. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single word carved itself permanently into his mind. I told him the bank did not hold his debt anymore. I told him I did. Connor looked down at the black leather cover. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely open the folder. He peeled back the cover and stared at the crisp white documents inside. He saw the corporate letterhead of Apex Industrial Holdings. He saw the legal assignment of his promissory notes. He saw the digital signature of his shadow lenders transferring every single ounce of his toxic debt directly to my holding company. He saw the copy of the formal margin call that had been sent to his private email the night before. He read the documents, and his entire reality fractured. The private equity firm he was so terrified of did not exist. It was merely a corporate mask hiding the face of his own father. He had forged my signature to steal from predatory lenders, and those lenders had sold the right to destroy him directly back to me. Connor dropped the papers. His knees gave out, and he collapsed heavily into his chair. The breath left his lungs in a long, ragged wheeze. He looked around his extravagant dining room. He looked at the crystal chandelier and the marble floors. He looked at his weeping wife. He realized none of it belonged to him anymore. I explained the exact parameters of his new reality. I told him he had missed the 5 o'clock deadline. I informed him that he was now in absolute default. I told him that every single asset he had leveraged was now my legal property. I owned the house he was sitting in. I owned the luxury cars parked in his driveway. I owned the balance of his private accounts. I had completely neutralized his medical conspiracy and legally absorbed his entire financial existence. Connor stared at me with completely dead eyes. The arrogant predator was gone. The manipulative son was dead. There was only a broken, empty man sitting in a house he no longer owned. He had tried to steal my independence, and in the process he had handed me the absolute legal authority to erase his entire life. The demolition was complete. The silent reckoning was over. Order had been permanently restored. Connor stared at the documents spread across the polished marble. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked at the corporate logo of Apex Industrial Holdings, and then he looked up at me. His eyes were wide with a terror that completely consumed him. He stammered, asking how a massive private equity firm could be connected to me. I sat perfectly still and let his confusion fester for a long moment. I wanted him to fully digest the absolute trap he had walked into. I kept my voice incredibly calm and low. I told him that Apex Industrial Holdings was not a faceless corporation of Wall Street bankers. I told him it was a private holding company I had established nearly 30 years ago to quietly manage the profits from my manufacturing plants. I told him I was the sole director and the absolute owner of the entire entity. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty chalk. He realized the magnitude of his fatal error. When he had gone to the shadow lenders to finance his desperate lifestyle, he had offered my commercial properties as collateral. Those lenders immediately sought to verify the assets and offload the risk. They contacted the largest industrial holding company in the region to sell the debt. They contacted me. I had quietly purchased every single promissory note my son had signed. I had become his sole creditor. I owned his debt, and now I owned him. Anthony stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway. He moved with the silent efficiency of a phantom. He did not look at Valerie, who was still sobbing quietly into her hands. He did not look at the spilled water or the ruined dinner. He walked directly to the edge of the marble table and stood over my broken son. Anthony reached inside his tailored charcoal jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He placed it squarely on top of the fraudulent conservatorship papers Connor had tried to force me to sign. Anthony spoke for the first time all evening. His voice was clinical and entirely devoid of human empathy. He informed Connor that he was officially served. Anthony explained that the documents inside the envelope were immediate notices of default and foreclosure. He told Connor that because the margin call had expired at 5:00, the asset seizure protocols were already active. Every bank account associated with Connor and Valerie was currently frozen. The luxury vehicles parked in the circular driveway were subject to immediate repossession. The suburban mansion we were sitting in was now the legal property of Apex Industrial Holdings. Anthony stated that they were officially bankrupt and entirely destitute. Connor shook his head violently. He grasped the edge of the table and tried to push himself up, but his legs refused to support his weight. He slumped back into the heavy mahogany chair. He told me I could not do this to him. He claimed the collateral for the loans was tied strictly to my manufacturing lots and not his personal home. He insisted his house was protected. He thought he still had a legal shield to hide behind. He was still clinging to the delusion that he was smarter than the man who had built his entire world. I leaned forward and rested my arms on the table. I told Connor to look very closely at the second page of the collateral agreement. I told him to look at the signature line. Connor reached out with trembling fingers and turned the page. He stared at the ink. He saw his own forgery staring back at him. I explained the fatal flaw in his arrogant plan. To secure the massive shadow loans he needed to prove he had the authority to leverage my commercial properties. He had forged my signature on the deeds and the loan applications. He had committed a textbook case of felony forgery and massive bank fraud. I laid out the exact parameters of his nightmare. I told him that the bribing of the disgraced doctor was enough to secure a federal wire fraud conviction. I explained that Valerie breaking into my duplex and destroying my property guaranteed her a prison sentence as an accomplice, but the forgery on the commercial real estate documents elevated his crimes into an entirely different realm of the federal justice system. I told him the mandatory minimum sentence for defrauding a financial institution with forged commercial deeds was counted in decades, not years. I had the absolute power to hand those 3 black folders to the federal prosecutor tomorrow morning. I told him that if I made that phone call, he and his wife would spend the rest of their natural lives in a federal penitentiary. Valerie let out a wretched sobbing gasp. She buried her face in her arms and rocked back and forth in her chair. The lavish lifestyle she had married into was completely obliterated. There would be no more country club dinners or luxury vacations. There would only be concrete walls and steel bars. She turned her head and looked at Connor with an expression of pure, venomous hatred. She blamed him entirely for their destruction. Connor stared at the forged signature. He could not speak. He could not breathe. He was completely trapped in a prison of his own making. He looked at me with hollow, empty eyes. He silently begged for the mercy he had never intended to show me. I offered him the only exit that existed. I told him it was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of complete and permanent excision. I told him he had exactly two choices. He could wait for the federal marshals to arrive tomorrow morning and drag him out of his house in handcuffs, or he could surrender everything tonight and walk away. I instructed Anthony to slide the final document across the table. It was a deed of voluntary forfeiture. I told Connor he would sign over the entire suburban property to Apex Industrial Holdings immediately. I told him he would surrender the keys to the luxury cars and relinquish all claims to any remaining assets. I told him that he and Valerie were allowed to pack exactly 2 suitcases with their personal clothing. They would walk out the front door tonight, and they would never contact me again. If they vanished into the night with absolutely nothing, I would lock the federal evidence in a vault and allow them to live. They would live in absolute poverty, but they would be free. Connor looked at the voluntary forfeiture deed. He looked at his weeping wife and the cold marble floors of the dining room. The arrogance and the greed had been completely burned out of him. He reached a shaking hand across the table and picked up the heavy silver pen Valerie had dropped earlier. The pen they had brought to steal my freedom was now the instrument of their own total surrender. Connor pressed the tip of the pen to the paper and signed his name. He signed away his house, his cars, and his entire identity. Valerie reached out and signed her name next to his, sealing their absolute destitution. I watched the ink dry on the paper. The transaction was completely finalized. I gathered the 3 black binders and the newly signed deeds and placed them carefully into my worn leather satchel. I fastened the metal buckle and stood up from the table. I looked down at the strangers sitting in the dark dining room. I told them they had exactly 1 hour to pack their suitcases and leave my house. I turned my back on them and walked out the front door into the cool evening air. The silent reckoning was complete, and order was permanently restored. The heavy silence in the dining room felt like a physical weight pressing down upon the polished marble table. Anthony quietly gathered the signed documents and slipped them into his leather briefcase. The ink on the voluntary forfeiture deeds was barely dry, but the transfer of power was absolute and irreversible. The sprawling suburban mansion and every luxury vehicle parked outside no longer belonged to my son. The shadow debt had been completely neutralized and weaponized against him. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing finality. Valerie sat frozen in her heavy wooden chair. Her tear-streaked face was pale and completely devoid of the smug superiority she had displayed just an hour ago. She stared at the empty space on the table where the black leather folders had rested. The reality of her absolute financial ruin was washing over her in freezing waves. She realized that her designer clothing and her expensive jewelry were no longer supported by a foundation of stolen wealth. She was entirely destitute. Worse than the poverty was the crushing terror of the federal evidence. She was a criminal caught on high-definition hidden cameras. She knew I held the absolute power to send her to a federal penitentiary for breaking into my duplex and staging the fraudulent dementia evidence. She slowly turned her head and looked at the man she had married. The superficial devotion she had faked for years evaporated into thin air. Her features twisted into a mask of pure and unfiltered disgust. She looked at Connor not as a partner, but as the architect of her impending doom. The alliance between husband and wife shattered instantly under the pressure of their total defeat. Valerie began to speak. Her voice started as a low, venomous hiss and rapidly escalated into a furious and piercing shriek. She told Connor he was a pathetic and complete failure. She screamed that he had promised her a life of guaranteed luxury and endless resources. She reminded him of the arrogant lies he had told her about my supposed mental weakness and my inability to defend my industrial empire. She yelled that he had assured her the hostile takeover of my assets would be simple and entirely without risk. Connor recoiled from her verbal assault. He raised his hands and begged her to lower her voice. He glanced nervously at Anthony and me, still terrified of the authority we now held over his existence. He told Valerie they needed to stay calm and figure out a way to survive the night. Valerie did not stop. She leaned across the marble table and escalated her vicious attack. She told him his blinding arrogance had destroyed their lives. She called him completely incompetent for failing to realize that the private equity firm holding his shadow debt was actually my own holding company. She screamed that he had dragged her into a massive federal conspiracy and left her entirely exposed to decades in a prison cell. She pointed a shaking finger at his face and blamed him entirely for the photographs of her vandalizing my home. She yelled that he was the one who had forced her to stage the squalor because he was too much of a coward to do it himself. Connor finally snapped. The sheer terror of his bankruptcy fueled a sudden and violent defensive rage. He shouted right back at her. He told her she was more than happy to pour the milk on my floor and kick my bills across the room when she thought it would secure her access to my bank accounts. He reminded her that she wanted my money just as badly as he did. He told her she had gleefully spent the stolen corporate funds on lavish vacations and expensive renovations, while he was desperately trying to manage the aggressive shadow lenders. He called her a parasite who only cared about his bank balance. The argument devolved into a vicious and pathetic brawl. They tore away every remaining shred of dignity they had left. They accused each other of boundless greed and profound stupidity. They threw their shared crimes into each other's faces, completely ignoring the fact that Anthony and I were standing right there listening to their mutual confessions. They showed absolutely no loyalty and no love. The elegant suburban marriage they had projected to the world was exposed as nothing more than a transactional arrangement built entirely upon my stolen money. The moment the money vanished, the marriage immediately turned into a cage match. I stood quietly near the head of the table and watched them destroy each other. I felt absolutely no pity for either of them. I felt no sorrow for the son I had raised. The man screaming across the table was a stranger who had actively plotted to erase my autonomy and lock me in a medical prison. The woman shrieking at him was an intruder who had violated the sanctity of my home with a smile on her face. They were drowning in a toxic ocean of their own making. They had believed they were apex predators hunting a weak and defenseless elder. They now understood they were merely foolish scavengers caught in a meticulously designed snare. I let them scream until their throats grew raw. I let them exhaust their pathetic rage and expend their useless energy. I waited until they were both panting and glaring at each other across the ruined dining room. I took a single step forward. The movement was small, but it commanded total silence. Connor and Valerie stopped bickering and turned their terrified eyes toward me. I told them their pathetic performance was over. I stated that I had absolutely no interest in their domestic disputes or their sudden and profound regrets. I told them they were completely irrelevant to me now. I informed them that they had exactly 48 hours to entirely vacate the property. I outlined the strict parameters of their departure. I told them they were permitted to take only their personal clothing and their basic toiletries. I explicitly stated that they would leave the expensive furniture, the valuable artwork, and the luxury vehicles behind. I reminded them that every single item of value in the house was now the legal property of Apex Industrial Holdings. I told them that if they attempted to steal a single item on their way out, or if they caused any damage to the property during the next 48 hours, I would immediately hand the 3 black folders directly to the federal authorities. I told them they would walk away with absolutely nothing and they would be profoundly grateful that I was allowing them to walk away at all. Connor opened his mouth to ask for a small loan to help them secure a cheap apartment. He begged for just enough cash to keep them off the streets. I cut him off immediately. I told him there would be no financial parachute. I told him there would be no severance package and no secret bank account waiting to save them. I stated that they would face the absolute reality of the poverty they had tried to force upon me. I turned to Anthony and instructed him to arrange for private security to monitor the house for the next 48 hours to ensure they complied with every single condition of their eviction. I turned my back on my former son and his weeping wife and walked slowly out of the dining room, leaving them completely alone in the cold ruins of their shattered lives. I stepped out of the heavy double doors and walked down the wide brick path. The cool night air felt incredibly clean against my skin. It felt as if a suffocating weight had been lifted from my chest. I reached my sedan parked in the circular driveway and opened the door. I placed my worn leather satchel carefully onto the passenger seat. Before I could even turn the key in the ignition, the sound of heavy diesel engines shattered the quiet suburban street. Two massive flatbed tow trucks turned into the driveway. Their amber lights flashed rhythmically, painting the manicured lawns and the towering white columns in harsh yellow strokes. Anthony had orchestrated this final detail with his usual terrifying precision. He had contracted the repossession teams the moment Connor missed the 5:00 margin call. I sat in my car and watched the men in dark jackets step out of the trucks. They moved with mechanical efficiency. They secured heavy steel chains to the axles of the two luxury vehicles parked near the garage. I looked up at the massive front window of the mansion. Connor was standing behind the glass. His silhouette was completely rigid. He was watching his entire fabricated identity being dragged away into the night. Valerie stood a few feet behind him with her hands covering her face. They were no longer the arrogant masters of a stolen empire. They were prisoners trapped inside a bankrupt shell, watching the consequences of their greed arrive in real time. The heavy winch gears groaned loudly as the expensive cars were pulled slowly onto the tilted steel beds. The engines roared and the trucks pulled out of the driveway, leaving completely empty spaces behind. The illusion was gone. I put my car in gear and drove away without looking back a single time. The drive back across the city was completely silent and deeply comforting. I watched the sprawling gated communities fade into ordinary neighborhoods and eventually into the modest, familiar streets of my own working-class community. I parked in front of my small duplex. The exterior was plain and weathered by decades of sun and rain. It was not a monument to wealth or a fragile symbol of status. It was a sturdy shelter built on honest labor and careful saving. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house was exactly as I had left it. The kitchen floor was spotless, and the bills were neatly stacked on the small wooden table. The chaotic squalor Valerie had maliciously staged was completely gone. I had spent hours scrubbing the floor and repairing the damage she had done because I absolutely refused to let her malice stain my private sanctuary. I walked into my small study and turned on the brass desk lamp. The warm yellow light spilled across the worn wooden surface. A thick stack of legal documents was waiting for me right where Anthony had left them earlier that afternoon. I sat down in my comfortable chair and pulled the thick pages toward me. These were not foreclosure notices or conservatorship threats. These were the final instruments of my legacy and the ultimate protection of my life work. The documents outlined the complete legal transfer of my commercial manufacturing lots. I was not selling them to another faceless private equity firm or hoarding the profits. I was donating the entire industrial complex to a local vocational trade school foundation. I read through the specific clauses and the strict stipulations Anthony had drafted under my direct supervision. The massive wealth generated by those bustling factories would permanently fund scholarships and purchase heavy equipment for young men and women learning how to weld and build and create with their own hands. I thought about the first time I held a blowtorch on a noisy factory floor. I remembered the painful blisters and the severe burns and the profound, enduring satisfaction of building something tangible from raw steel. Connor had always hated the harsh smell of the factory floor. He had viewed the grease and the deafening noise with absolute contempt, believing he was born for polished boardrooms and effortless luxury. He had wanted to harvest the vast profits without ever understanding the grueling sacrifice required to generate them. I picked up my pen and signed my name at the bottom of the last page. I was permanently severing the toxic branch of my lineage and grafting my legacy onto those who truly understood the value of calloused hands and honest, grueling work. The ink dried quickly on the heavy paper. The wealth was permanently locked away from predatory heirs and corporate scavengers. I closed the thick folder and left it resting quietly on the desk. I walked into the kitchen and prepared the old coffee maker. I moved slowly and deliberately, letting the simple domestic routine ground my racing thoughts. The sky outside the kitchen window was just beginning to transition from deep black to a soft, fragile purple. The long, exhausting night of execution was finally ending. I poured the steaming black liquid into my favorite ceramic mug. The bitter, roasted aroma filled the small room, cutting through the lingering exhaustion, settling deep into my bones. I walked out onto my small concrete porch and sat down in the wooden rocking chair. The morning air was crisp and completely still. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up from a deep slumber. I watched an elderly neighbor walk out in his slippers to retrieve his morning newspaper. I heard the distant, familiar hum of a delivery truck moving down the main avenue. The world was continuing its natural, steady rhythm, entirely undisturbed by the massive financial collapse that had occurred across the city. I took a slow, careful sip of the hot coffee. The strong, bitter taste felt incredibly grounding and real. I thought about Connor and Valerie waking up in a massive, empty mansion they no longer owned. I knew they would be frantically scrambling to pack their 2 allowed suitcases before the private security teams arrived to escort them off the property forever. They were facing a harsh and unforgiving wilderness they had never once prepared for. I felt absolutely no guilt for their current circumstances. I felt no lingering sorrow for the family I had lost. The quiet father who had silently endured their endless abuse was completely gone. The old man who had foolishly hoped for their moral redemption had been burned away by their betrayal. I had successfully inverted the corrupt power dynamic and restored the natural order of my universe. I rested the warm mug on my knee and watched the first bright rays of the sun crest over the nearby rooftops. The golden light hit my face, warming my tired skin and illuminating the quiet street. The sprawling industrial trust was finally secure. The greedy predators had been systematically eradicated from my life. My mind was completely sharp, and my future was entirely my own. The air entering my lungs felt lighter than it had in many years. The silence resting on my porch was no longer a stoic endurance of profound disrespect. It was the absolute, unbroken peace of a man who had won the final war. The ultimate lesson derived from this narrative is that true authority is preserved through calculated silence rather than chaotic emotional outbursts. When confronted with the profound betrayal of entitled heirs, the patriarch refuses to engage in useless arguments. He instead channels his restraint into a methodical masterstroke that systematically dismantles their deceit. This teaches us that establishing absolute boundaries is entirely essential for protecting our legacy and our dignity. By permitting the gradually increasing consequences to hold the greedy accountable, he reclaims his power completely. It is a stark reminder that authentic peace demands the relentless protection of our own inherent worth. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please share it across your platforms and follow our channel for more compelling narratives.